The night my life changed forever began like any other. I, Andrew, a simple food delivery driver in Cleveland, Ohio, could never have imagined what was about to happen. The familiar streets of the city, which I traveled every night, always gave me a sense of comfort and predictability. Every corner, every alley, every address, I knew them like the back of my hand. Or at least I thought I did. My nightly routine was a well-rehearsed ballet of orders, deliveries, and polite smiles at the door. Cleveland at night had its own beauty. The city lights shimmered like earthly stars, reflecting off the waters of Lake Erie. I loved watching the city fall asleep while I made my deliveries. The residential neighborhoods with their cozy homes, the downtown with its towering skyscrapers, and even the industrial areas with their rustic charm, all had become part of my nightly rhythm. The familiarity of these places gave me a sense of security, as if nothing could surprise me. My job as a nighttime delivery driver had become more than just a job. It was a fundamental part of my life, a constant I could count on every night. Orders came in a steady, predictable flow. Pizzas for students pulling all-nighters, burgers for night shift workers, and occasionally, gourmet meals for couples on late-night dates. I knew the best routes, the most efficient shortcuts, and even the traffic lights that tended to stay red the longest. The monotony of my routine, far from being boring, was comforting. There was something soothing about knowing exactly what to expect each night. The faces of regular customers, the familiar smells wafting from the bags of food, the soft hum of my car's engine as I cruised through the city streets. It had all become a well-known symphony of my nocturnal life. I took pride in my efficiency and in the intimate knowledge I had of every corner of Cleveland. But that fateful night, something different happened. A strange order appeared in my app, sending me to a part of the city I had never explored before. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, what could be so different about one more Cleveland neighborhood? Little did I know that this simple delivery would lead me on a journey that would challenge everything I thought I knew about my city and myself. With a sigh of anticipation, I started my car and headed into the unknown, leaving behind the safety of the familiar. As I drove toward the new address, a feeling of unease began to settle in my stomach. The familiar streets of Cleveland faded into the distance, giving way to avenues I didn't recognize. The GPS on my phone, usually so reliable, seemed confused, constantly changing directions. With each turn, I felt more lost, as if I were entering an unknown urban labyrinth. The city's lights, once abundant, became sparse. The streets narrowed, flanked by old, shadowy houses. The streetlights, once reassuring, were now reduced to a few scattered posts casting unsettling shadows on the empty sidewalks. The silence of the night, once familiar, now felt charged with a palpable tension, making me grip the steering wheel tighter. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just an unfamiliar neighborhood, nothing more. But something in the air, a heavy, oppressive atmosphere, told me I was entering territory that should have remained unexplored. The streets seemed to twist before my eyes, forming a confusing, intimidating pattern that defied my understanding. The GPS kept changing its mind, guiding me down narrower and darker streets. The disorientation grew with each passing minute, and I began to wonder if I would ever find my way back. The houses around me seemed to watch my passage with dark windows that resembled empty eyes, heightening my sense of discomfort. I glanced at my phone again, hoping the GPS would finally point me in the right direction. The screen flickered with conflicting instructions, as if even the technology was lost in this strange neighborhood. The initial unease turned into a growing fear. Something inside me screamed to turn around, to abandon the delivery and return to the safety of the streets I knew. But a mix of stubbornness and a sense of duty pushed me to continue, even though every fiber of my being was telling me to run. After what felt like an eternity navigating through winding streets and shadowy alleys, the GPS finally announced that I had arrived at my destination. I parked in front of a house that made my heart freeze. It was an old, imposing structure wrapped in a darkness that felt almost tangible. The windows were boarded up, and the peeling paint revealed years of neglect. A shiver ran down my spine as I stared at the house. The yard was overgrown with weeds that seemed to want to swallow everything around them. The front porch creaked beneath my feet as I took a hesitant step toward it. The air around the house felt thicker, as if it was charged with the dark secrets those walls held. I hesitated, my hand on the car door handle. My instinct screamed at me to start the engine and drive away as fast as I could. The oppressive atmosphere of the place seemed to drain all the courage I had. But something inside me, maybe a misguided sense of duty or sheer stubbornness, pushed me to complete the delivery. With trembling steps, I approached the front door. The old wood groaned under my touch as I knocked, the sound echoing disturbingly through the silent house. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest as the seconds dragged on. No response came. I knocked again, harder this time, fighting the urge to run back to the car. The silence that followed was deafening. Not even the usual sounds of the city seemed to reach this forgotten place. I was about to give up and leave when I heard a sound from inside the house. It was a soft noise, almost imperceptible, like muffled footsteps approaching the door. My breath caught in my throat as I waited, uncertain of what, or who, I would find when the door finally opened. The footsteps stopped, but the door remained closed. My heart was pounding so loudly, I feared it might be heard on the other side. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. Turning slowly, I felt my blood run cold. From the shadows of the overgrown yard, silent figures began to emerge, as if materializing from the darkness itself. They were people, or at least they seemed to be, but something about them was terribly wrong. Each wore a smooth, white, expressionless mask that reflected the pale moonlight. Their movements were fluid, almost graceful, but in a way that seemed unnatural. They approached in complete silence, forming a circle around me. I tried to speak, to scream, to make any sound, but my voice was trapped in my throat. Terror paralyzed me completely. The masked figures continued to close in, their empty eyes fixed on me. There was nowhere to run. They had effectively blocked all my routes of escape. The air grew thicker with each passing second, making it harder to breathe. My mind screamed for me to react, to fight or flee, but my body refused to obey. The figures were now so close I could see the details of their masks. Smooth, white surfaces devoid of any trace of humanity. One of the figures extended a hand toward me. Its fingers were long and pale, almost translucent in the moonlight. At that moment, I finally found my voice and let out a scream of terror. But the sound was quickly swallowed by the night, as if the darkness itself had devoured it. The masked figures closed in, and I knew my fate was sealed. Before I could react, the masked figures grabbed me. Their hands were cold as ice, sending shivers of terror through my entire body. I tried to fight, to struggle, but it was as if all my strength had been drained. They dragged me toward the shadowy house, my feet barely touching the ground. The front door opened silently, revealing an interior as dark as pitch. The smell of mold and decay filled my nose as I was pulled inside. The darkness seemed to swallow everything, including the sounds of my dragging footsteps and ragged breathing. Once inside, the masked figures began to strip me of my belongings. My phone, wallet, car keys, everything was taken from me with a chilling, silent efficiency. I tried to protest, to plead, but no sound came from my mouth. The panic grew inside me, threatening to choke me. The atmosphere inside the house was oppressive, as if the very air was charged with malice. The masked figures guided me through dark hallways, their grips firm on my arms. I had no idea where they were taking me, and the fear of the unknown was almost unbearable. Finally, we arrived at a room. It was small, completely devoid of furniture or windows. The figures pushed me inside, and before I could turn around, the door was closed and locked. I was left alone in total darkness, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it. The reality of my situation began to sink in. I was trapped, kidnapped by creatures that seemed born from a nightmare, and no one in the world knew where I was. The darkness around me was absolute, impenetrable. My eyes strained to catch any glimpse of light, but there was nothing but total blackness. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing and the frantic beating of my heart. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, as if the very air was pressing down on me. Gradually, my mind began to process what had happened. The masked figures, the shadowy house, my abduction, it all seemed so surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I tried to cry out for help, but my voice came out as a hoarse whisper, swallowed by the oppressive darkness around me. Time lost all meaning in that dark room. Minutes felt like hours, and hours could have been days. My thoughts oscillated between panic and disbelief. Who were those masked figures? What did they want from me? Why had I been chosen? Unanswered questions swirled in my mind, heightening my anxiety. Occasionally, I would hear distant sounds, muffled footsteps, indistinct whispers that made me freeze in fear. Every noise sent my heart racing, dreading the return of the masked figures. The anticipation of the unknown was almost as terrifying as the initial encounter. As time passed, the reality of my situation began to sink in. I was completely vulnerable, at the mercy of unknown and possibly dangerous captors. The darkness seemed to close in more and more around me, threatening to suffocate any hope of escape. In that moment, alone and terrified, I wondered if I would ever see daylight again. I don't know how long I remained in that dark room, but at some point, I heard a different sound, the creak of a door opening. A faint beam of light pierced the darkness, and I blinked, my sore eyes adjusting. This was my chance. With a strength I didn't know I still had, I lunged toward the opening. Surprisingly, I met no resistance. Stumbling through the dimly lit hallway, I heard shouts of alarm behind me. My heart raced as I ran, guided only by the instinct to survive. Every corridor seemed to stretch endlessly. Every door I passed was a promise of freedom left unfulfilled. Finally, I spotted a window. Without a second thought, I threw myself against it, feeling the glass shatter around me. The pain from the cuts barely registered in my mind, which was focused solely on escape. I fell into the overgrown yard, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I scrambled to my feet and started running. The streets around me seemed distorted, different from what I remembered. It was as if the very neighborhood was shifting, trying to confuse me and prevent my escape. I turned corners at random, desperate to find something familiar. After what felt like an eternity, I finally recognized a street. Relief flooded through me as I saw the familiar lights of the Cleveland I knew. I kept running until I was back in the safety of the bustling streets, where I finally allowed myself to stop, panting and trembling. I had escaped, but the feeling of terror lingered, as if the shadows of that strange neighborhood still followed me. Days passed after my escape from that nightmare, but the terror of that night still haunted me. I returned to my normal life, my apartment, my job, my routine, but nothing felt the same. The streets of Cleveland, once so familiar and comforting, now seemed to hide threats in every shadow. Every unfamiliar face in the crowd made me flinch, fearing to see a smooth, expressionless mask. Sleep became a rare luxury. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those silent figures emerging from the shadows, their cold hands dragging me into darkness. I would wake up screaming, drenched in cold sweat, my heart racing. The darkness of my bedroom, once comforting, now felt threatening. I began sleeping with the lights on, afraid of what might be lurking in the shadows. I tried to return to work as a delivery driver, but every order became an ordeal. The fear of being led back to that strange neighborhood was paralyzing. I started refusing deliveries to areas I didn't know well, my body trembling at the slightest sign of an unfamiliar neighborhood. Eventually, I had to quit. The thought of driving alone at night became unbearable. I sought professional help, desperate to understand and overcome what had happened. But how could I explain something so surreal, so impossible? Words seemed inadequate to describe the terror I had experienced. The therapist listened sympathetically, but I could see the disbelief in their eyes. No one truly believed my story, and that only deepened my sense of isolation. Even months later, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The smooth, expressionless masks appeared in my nightmares and in flashes during the day. Every unexpected sound, every moving shadow made me jump. I knew I had physically escaped that shadowy house, but mentally, a part of me was still trapped there, wandering through dark hallways, surrounded by silent, masked figures. The night that should have been just another delivery had turned into a never-ending nightmare, one I feared I might never fully wake up from. Salem, Massachusetts, has always been known for its rich and mysterious history, but our little neighborhood was an oasis of calm amidst all that mysticism. The houses lined up along tree-lined streets created a cozy atmosphere where time seemed to flow more slowly. As a child, I watched the almost predictable routines of our neighbors. Mr. Johnson watering his roses every morning, Mrs. Patel walking her dog at dusk, and children playing on the sidewalks until nightfall. It was a place where everyone knew each other but kept a respectful distance, as if there was an unspoken agreement not to invade each other's privacy. Among all the houses in the neighborhood, one stood out, not for its appearance but for the peculiar behavior of its owner. Mr. Taylor, a middle-aged man with considerable wealth, lived in an imposing mansion at the end of the street. His wealth was obvious, but what really caught people's attention was his nearly obsessive attachment to his car, a gleaming black 1967 Chevrolet Impala. Every single day, without fail, Mr. Taylor would spend hours washing, polishing, and inspecting every inch of that classic vehicle. His routine was so consistent that the neighbors joked they could set their clocks by it. From my bedroom window, I had a prime view of the Taylor house. I watched, fascinated, as Mr. Taylor, impeccably dressed even while tending to his car, moved with methodical precision around the vehicle. His hands, always protected by suede gloves, glided over the shiny surface with a near-reverential delicacy. It was as if the car was more than just a possession. It seemed to be the center of his universe, an extension of himself. The contrast between Mr. Taylor's devotion to his car and his indifference to the rest of the world was striking. We rarely saw him interact with the neighbors, and when he did, it was only with brief, distant nods. His expression always serious and his gaze fixed. He seemed constantly lost in thought, as if the world around him was a mere distraction from something far more important that occupied his mind. This reserved attitude fueled the curiosity and whispers of the neighborhood, turning Mr. Taylor into an enigmatic and slightly intimidating figure. At night, when the lights in Mr. Taylor's garage finally went out, I would lie in bed, wondering what might be going through the mind of such a solitary and obsessive man. What secrets was he keeping? What drove him to isolate himself so completely from the world around him? These questions danced through my thoughts as I drifted off to sleep, not knowing that soon, mysterious events would transform our quiet neighborhood and reveal that behind that facade of normalcy, dark secrets were about to come to light. If Mr. Taylor embodied isolation and coldness, his wife, Mrs. Taylor, was his exact opposite. With her perfectly styled golden hair and a warm smile always on her face, she was like a ray of sunshine in our neighborhood. While her husband rarely left the house except to care for his car, Mrs. Taylor was a constant, welcome presence in the streets. She greeted everyone with genuine interest, always ready for a friendly chat or to lend a helping hand. Her melodic laughter echoed through the streets, bringing life and joy to a place that might otherwise have been quite dull. The contrast between the Taylor couple was so stark that many in the neighborhood wondered how two such different people had ever come together. Mrs. Taylor seemed to float through life with a grace and lightness that stood in stark contrast to her husband's rigidity and isolation. She had a knack for making everyone feel special, remembering little details about the lives of her neighbors and always asking about family or important events. It was impossible not to feel welcomed in her presence, and soon she became the beating heart of our community. But the true jewel of the Taylor family was little Stacy, a 2-year-old who seemed to have inherited all of her mother's charisma and vivacity. With her golden curls and bright blue eyes, Stacy was adored by everyone. She ran through the streets with the boundless energy of a child, her contagious laughter echoing everywhere. The neighbors vied for her attention, offering her candies or toys whenever they saw her. Stacy had the power to turn even the most serious faces into smiles, and her presence brought a sense of innocence and joy to the entire neighborhood. Watching Mrs. Taylor with Stacy was witnessing a bond of pure, unconditional love. She dedicated every free moment to her daughter, playing in the yard, reading stories on the porch, or simply walking hand in hand down the street. It was as if their world was made of magic and happiness, a striking contrast to the dark aura that seemed to surround Mr. Taylor. I often wondered what the dynamics inside that house were like, with such distinct personalities under the same roof. Mrs. Taylor seemed to be the bridge between two worlds, her husband's isolation and the liveliness of the rest of the neighborhood. As the days passed, Mrs. Taylor and Stacy became beloved and indispensable figures in our community. Their presence brought a necessary balance, softening the sometimes tense atmosphere created by Mr. Taylor's reclusiveness. I admired how Mrs. Taylor navigated such a complex situation, maintaining her kindness and optimism despite the circumstances. She was an example of strength and grace, and I, like many others in the neighborhood, couldn't help but feel a deep admiration for her. Little did we know that this apparent harmony was about to be brutally shattered, throwing our peaceful neighborhood into a whirlwind of mystery and fear. The day Mrs. Taylor and Stacy disappeared began like any other. The summer sun shone on our quiet street, and I watched from my bedroom window, expecting to see Mrs. Taylor go out for her morning walk with Stacy. But the hours passed, and they never appeared. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, even the most established routines can change occasionally. However, as the day went on, a strange feeling began to settle over the neighborhood. Neighbors exchanged worried glances, and whispers began to circulate. Something was wrong. We could all feel it. It was late in the afternoon when the unthinkable became reality. Mr. Taylor emerged from his house, his usually impassive face now marked by an expression I had never seen before, a mix of confusion and something that seemed almost relief. He walked from door to door, calmly informing the neighbors that his wife had left, taking Stacy with her. His words were measured, almost rehearsed. She decided she needed some time away. Took some clothes and left with Stacy this morning while I was asleep. The way he spoke, without emotion, without urgency, made my stomach churn. The news spread like wildfire, and soon the entire neighborhood was in an uproar. How could Mrs. Taylor, so dedicated to the community and so loving toward her daughter, simply leave without saying a word to anyone? It didn't make sense. The police were called, and the officers arrived with their silent sirens, as if they too sensed that something more sinister was happening. They entered the Taylor house, and for hours we saw shadows moving behind the curtains, heard muffled voices, and waited for answers that never came. The investigation stretched on for days, which soon turned into weeks. Detectives scoured the house, questioned neighbors, checked travel records and bank transactions. But it was as if Mrs. Taylor and Stacy had simply vanished. There were no traces, no clues as to where they might have gone. Mrs. Taylor's car was still in the garage, her clothes still in the closet, Stacy's toys scattered around her room as if she had just been playing with them. The absence of evidence was in itself unsettling. Meanwhile, Mr. Taylor remained an enigmatic figure throughout the mystery. He cooperated with the police, answering questions with an almost supernatural calm. But there was something in his eyes, a cold, calculated look, that made me shudder every time I saw him. He kept to his routine, washing and polishing his car as he always had, as if the absence of his wife and daughter was just a minor inconvenience in his meticulously ordered life. At night, I lay awake, staring out the window at the Taylor house, wondering what secrets those walls held, what dark truths were hidden behind that facade of normality. As the weeks passed with no news of Mrs. Taylor and Stacy, our small, once peaceful community turned into a hotbed of speculation and theories. Rumors spread like a contagious disease, each one more wild and improbable than the last. In grocery store lines, at church gatherings, and during school meetings, the disappearance was the only topic of conversation. Some said Mrs. Taylor had a secret lover and had run away to start a new life. Others whispered about hidden financial problems, suggesting she might have stolen money from Mr. Taylor and disappeared to avoid the consequences. The darker theories, however, were the ones gaining the most traction. Murmurs of domestic violence began to circulate. People who had barely noticed Mr. Taylor before now swore they had seen bruises on Mrs. Taylor's face or heard heated arguments coming from their house. The idea that something terrible might have happened inside that house started to take root in everyone's mind. Fear and distrust grew, turning our once friendly neighborhood into a place where suspicious glances were cast from behind half-drawn curtains and conversations abruptly stopped when someone approached. Mr. Taylor, for his part, seemed completely oblivious to the rumors swirling around him. His behavior, however, grew increasingly strange. He rarely left the house now, except for essential shopping. His obsessive car care ritual, once as predictable as the sunrise, became erratic. Sometimes days went by without him touching the vehicle. At other times, he would spend hours polishing it in the middle of the night, the sound of the cloth against the metal echoing eerily down the silent street. It was as if he was losing control of his carefully constructed facade, and small cracks were starting to appear in his composure. The police continued their investigation, but without new leads, the case began to grow cold. Detectives still made occasional visits, asking repetitive questions and looking around with frustrated expressions. The lack of progress only fueled more speculation among the neighbors. Some began to question the authorities' competence, while others suggested elaborate conspiracies involving bribery and cover-ups. The truth, whatever it was, seemed more and more distant and unattainable. Amidst all this whirlwind of rumors and fear, I found myself becoming obsessed with the mystery. I spent hours watching the Taylor house, trying to catch any movement, any sign that might unravel the enigma. Sometimes, late at night, I swore I saw shadows moving behind the curtains, heard muffled sounds I couldn't quite identify. My parents began to worry about my fixation, but I couldn't stop. I felt like there was something there, just beneath the surface, a dark truth waiting to be uncovered. And I was determined to find out what really happened to Mrs. Taylor and little Stacy, no matter the cost. It was on a Sunday afternoon, about 2 months after the disappearance, that we noticed something that would change everything. My family and I were returning from an outing when my dad suddenly stopped the car. His eyes were fixed on the Taylor house, specifically the garage. There, partially visible, was Mrs. Taylor's Jeep. The vehicle that, according to Mr. Taylor, she had used to leave with Stacy was covered in a thick layer of dust, clearly untouched for weeks. The silence that followed in our car was deafening, each of us processing what that meant. My dad was the first to react, with a calmness that barely disguised his agitation. He asked us to go inside while he went to talk to some neighbors. I watched through the window as he met with Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Patel, his words whispered urgently and accompanied by frantic gestures. Soon, a small group formed on the street, all of them looking toward the Taylor house, the tension in the air palpable. The discovery of the Jeep was like the final piece of a macabre puzzle, confirming everyone's worst fears. The news spread quickly, and within hours, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with activity. How could Mr. Taylor have lied so blatantly? If Mrs. Taylor hadn't left in the Jeep, as he had claimed, what had really happened to her and Stacy? The darker theories, once only whispered, were now being discussed openly. The idea that something terrible had happened inside that house no longer seemed so absurd. The fear and distrust that had been building over the past weeks exploded in a wave of collective panic. The police were called again, and this time, their approach was very different. Detectives arrived with search warrants, their expressions grim as they entered the Taylor house. I watched as they took Mr. Taylor to the station, his face as impassive as ever, but there was something in his eyes, a glimmer of fear, perhaps, that made me shiver. The house was cordoned off with police tape, and for days we saw forensic specialists going in and out carrying boxes and equipment. The entire neighborhood seemed to have come to a standstill, all of us caught in a state of shock and anticipation. At night, lying in bed, I couldn't take my eyes off the window, watching the now silent and dark Taylor house. The dust-covered Jeep in the garage was a constant reminder that something terrible had happened there. I wondered where Mrs. Taylor and Stacy were at that moment. Were they alive? The thought that something might have happened to them, especially sweet Stacy, was almost unbearable. That night, and on many nights to come, sleep eluded me, my mind filled with terrible images and unanswered questions. In the days that followed the discovery of the Jeep, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed drastically. Fear gave way to a silent anger, directed mainly at Mr. Taylor. He had returned from the station after a lengthy interrogation, but now rarely left his house. When he did, he was met with accusatory stares and hostile whispers. The man who had once been just an eccentric, distant figure was now viewed as a possible monster living among us. His presence caused discomfort and fear, with people crossing the street to avoid walking near him. Mr. Taylor's behavior became increasingly erratic. His car, once the center of his obsession, now sat abandoned in the driveway, collecting dust and leaves. The curtains of his house remained permanently drawn, but sometimes, late at night, we could see lights moving inside, as if he were in a frenzy of activity. The sounds coming from the house also changed. Occasionally, we heard the noises of things being dragged or broken, followed by long periods of eerie silence. The police continued their investigation, but progress seemed slow. Patrol cars regularly passed by our street, and detectives made frequent visits to the Taylor house. Each time I saw them leave, their frustrated, tired expressions told me they were far from solving the mystery. The lack of concrete answers only fueled more speculation in the neighborhood. Theories grew more elaborate and sinister, some involving occult rituals, others suggesting that bodies might be buried in the Taylor backyard. It was in this atmosphere of fear and suspicion that I noticed something even more disturbing. Mr. Taylor had begun taking frequent late-night trips. Late at night, when most of the neighborhood was asleep, I would see him sneak out of his house, carrying heavy bags to his car. He would leave and return hours later, always looking agitated and nervous. These mysterious outings happened so regularly that they intrigued and frightened me. What could he be doing? Where was he going with such urgency in the middle of the night? I decided to share my observations with my parents, who were visibly disturbed. After a moment of hesitation, my dad decided to inform the police. The detectives listened carefully, but they didn't seem surprised. I realized we probably weren't the only ones who had noticed Mr. Taylor's strange behavior. In the following days, I noticed an increase in police surveillance, especially at night. The tension in the neighborhood reached nearly unbearable levels. We all felt that something was about to happen, that the truth, however terrible it might be, was about to come to light. And I, in my growing obsession, was determined not to miss a single detail of whatever was coming. The night everything changed started like so many others during that tense summer. I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, my eyes fixed on the window that overlooked the Taylor house. The clock showed just after midnight when a sudden noise shattered the silence. It was a sharp, metallic sound like something heavy had fallen. I sat up abruptly, my heart racing. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then I heard muffled voices and the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. I ran to wake my parents, my words tumbling out as I tried to explain what I had heard. My dad, still groggy but alert, went to the hallway window that offered the best view of the Taylor house. I followed him, trembling with fear and excitement. The scene unfolding across the street was surreal. Through a partially covered window, we saw Mr. Taylor moving frantically around the kitchen. In his right hand gleamed what looked like a weapon, but what we saw next made my blood run cold. On the kitchen floor, a dark liquid spread, reflecting the dim light of the room. Mr. Taylor seemed to be trying to clean whatever it was, his movements erratic and desperate. My dad, his voice trembling, muttered something about calling the police and rushed to get the phone. I remained frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from the macabre scene. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. That liquid, Could it be blood? What had Mr. Taylor done? The minutes that followed seemed to drag on forever. I heard my dad speaking urgently into the phone, his voice a hushed whisper. My mom joined us at the window, her hand gripping my shoulder tightly. Together, we watched as Mr. Taylor continued his frantic cleaning, occasionally glancing around as if he feared being caught. The distant sound of sirens began to grow louder, and I saw panic spread across Mr. Taylor's face. He stopped abruptly, looked directly toward our house, as if he knew we were watching, and then disappeared from view. The blue and red lights of the police cars soon flooded the street, reflecting off the windows of the neighboring houses. Armed officers surrounded the Taylor property, shouting orders for him to come out with his hands up. The silence that followed was deafening. Minutes passed without any movement. Then, suddenly the front door slowly opened. Mr. Taylor emerged, his hands trembling visibly as he raised them. His face, once always impassive, was now contorted in a mask of fear and defeat. As the police handcuffed him and led him away, he looked once more in our direction. At that moment, his eyes met mine, and what I saw in them would haunt me forever. A mixture of despair, guilt, and something that seemed almost relief. The years that followed that night were marked by a mix of shocking revelations and unanswered questions. The police investigation, now with unrestricted access to the Taylor property, unearthed horrors that no one in our quiet neighborhood could have imagined. Forensic evidence, testimonies, and finally a partial confession from Mr. Taylor painted a terrible picture of what had happened to Mrs. Taylor and little Stacy. The full details were never made public, but the rumors that circulated were enough to give anyone nightmares. Our family moved shortly after, unable to continue living in the shadow of that house and the memories it evoked. But the change of location didn't erase the emotional scars those events left behind. For years, I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, haunted by nightmares in which I saw Stacy's terrified face or heard Mrs. Taylor's muffled screams. The image of Mr. Taylor on that last night, with the gun in his hand and that dark liquid on the floor, remained burned into my mind, resurfacing at the most unexpected moments. The Taylor case became a kind of urban legend, discussed in whispers and used to scare misbehaving children. Journalists and writers tried to piece the story together, but there always seemed to be crucial pieces missing. The more I tried to understand, the more questions arose. How had no one noticed anything before? Were there signs we ignored? What really happened inside that house in the weeks between the disappearance and the discovery? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, if we had acted sooner, could we have saved Mrs. Taylor and Stacy? As I grew up and built my own life, I tried to leave the past behind, but the fear and uncertainty of those days never completely left me. I became hypersensitive to any signs of danger or abuse, perhaps as a way of compensating for not realizing what was happening right next door. Every time I heard about a missing person or domestic violence case, the events of that summer came rushing back, reminding me of how evil can hide in the most unsuspecting places. Today, decades later, I still find myself thinking about Mrs. Taylor and Stacy, about how their lives were brutally interrupted, about all the futures that were stolen from them. I think about our neighborhood and how all of us were forever changed by those events. And I think about Mr. Taylor, the man I once knew only as the neighbor obsessed with his car, now a monster in my memory. The answers we received over the years never seemed enough to explain the depth of the tragedy. And so, the mystery of Mrs. Taylor's disappearance remains, in some ways, unresolved in my mind. A constant reminder that sometimes the darkest secrets hide behind the most ordinary facades, and that true horror might be living right next door. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. when I finally spotted the house. My eyes stung with fatigue as I strained to read the numbers on the mailbox. It was my last delivery of the night, and honestly, all I wanted was to get it over with and head home. The shift had been long and exhausting, as Friday nights always were. The streets were quiet at that hour, except for the occasional distant bark of a dog. As I got closer to the address, A chill ran down my spine. Something about that house didn't feel right. I parked in front and turned off the engine, plunging the car into an unsettling silence. The darkness around me was almost tangible. No lights came from the windows, no sound of a TV or conversation. It was as if the house was completely abandoned. I frowned, double-checking the address on the delivery app. It was correct, but how could someone be expecting pizza in such a grim, seemingly empty place? I sighed deeply, the weight of exhaustion pressing harder on my shoulders. I just wanted to get this over with. I grabbed the pizza box from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car, immediately feeling the cold night air against my face. The wind whispered through the trees, making the leaves rustle in an almost threatening way. I walked slowly toward the front door, my footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. With each step, the feeling that something was wrong grew inside me. The overgrown grass and neglected yard only heightened the sense of abandonment. I reached the porch and hesitated for a moment before ringing the doorbell. The sound echoed through the empty house, but no one came to answer. I waited a few seconds and tried again. Nothing. The discomfort I felt turned into a growing sense of anxiety. It wasn't unusual for customers to take their time answering, especially late at night, but something about this felt different. Wrong. Dangerous even. I glanced around, feeling exposed and vulnerable in the darkness. The shadows seemed to shift at the edges of my vision, as if something or someone was watching me. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off these irrational thoughts. I decided to try one last time before giving up and leaving. I rang the bell and knocked on the door harder this time, almost internally pleading for someone to answer and put an end to this uncomfortable situation. The silence that followed was deafening. I was about to turn and head back to the car when I noticed a subtle movement behind one of the windows on the second floor. A glimpse of a curtain moving, perhaps? Or was it just my imagination playing tricks on me, fueled by exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of the place? Whatever it was the final straw. My heart began to race, and I knew I had to get out of there as soon as possible. With my hands trembling slightly, I pulled out my phone. I was about to mark the delivery as not completed when I decided to make one last attempt, calling the customer. I dialed the number associated with the order, my fingers sliding nervously across the screen. The ringing tone echoed in my ears, each ring amplifying my anxiety. Just when I was about to hang up, I heard a click and a woman's voice answered. "Hello." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, and carried a palpable tension that caught me off guard. "Hi, this is Brian from the pizzeria. I'm outside your house with your order," I explained, trying to keep my voice steady despite the discomfort I felt. There was a pause on the other end, so long that I thought the call had dropped. Then, the woman spoke again, her voice even more tense than before. "Please wait. I'm coming." Something about the way she spoke, a mix of fear and urgency, made my stomach churn. Before I could respond, she hung up. I stood on the porch, holding the phone and the pizza box, unsure of what to do. The whole situation seemed increasingly strange. Why wasn't she home? Why did she sound so scared? And why did I have this growing feeling that something was very wrong? The cold wind blew again, making the trees around the house groan. I nervously glanced over my shoulder, feeling as though I was being watched. I considered leaving. After all, I had already done more than enough by sticking around for this long. But something kept me from leaving. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was genuine concern for the woman's tone of voice on the phone. Whatever it was, I decided to wait a little longer. I returned to my car, locking the doors as soon as I got in. From inside, I kept my eyes on the house and the surrounding streets, alert for any movement. The minutes dragged on. Every second felt like an eternity as I waited, the silence of the night broken only by the ticking of the car's clock and my own breathing. I tried to distract myself by checking my phone, but my eyes kept drifting back to the dark house and the empty streets. The feeling that something was about to happen wouldn't leave me. It was as if the air was charged with a strange energy, a tension ready to explode. And I was stuck in the middle of it all, not knowing what to expect. As time passed, another problem began to nag at me. My bladder was about to burst. I had downed several coffees during the shift to stay awake, and now they were taking their toll. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, trying to ignore the growing pressure. But soon it became clear that I couldn't wait much longer. I looked around, desperate for a solution. The house remained dark and silent, with no sign of the woman who had asked me to wait. I took a deep breath, weighing my options. I could try to find a gas station or a store that was still open, but that would mean leaving the location and possibly missing the customer. Plus, driving in that state didn't seem very safe. The other option was, well, it wasn't exactly professional, but given the circumstances, it seemed like the only solution. Reluctantly, I stepped out of the car again, locking it and putting the key in my pocket. I walked over to a cluster of bushes near the house, staying alert for any sounds or movement. The relief was immediate when I finally took care of business, but it didn't last long. As I finished, a subtle noise caught my attention. It was almost imperceptible at first, but it grew clearer. The sound of leaves and branches rustling, as if someone, or something, was moving among the bushes further ahead. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a cat or a raccoon, but the way the sound moved, deliberate and careful, felt terrifyingly human. With trembling hands, I quickly finished adjusting my clothes. My eyes scanned the darkness frantically, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. The sound had stopped, but that only heightened my anxiety. I felt as if something or someone was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The night, which had once seemed merely eerie and uncomfortable, now felt downright menacing. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every sound could be a warning. I began to slowly back away toward the car, never taking my eyes off the bushes. And then I saw it, a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. A dark figure moved among the shadows, so fast I almost thought I had imagined it. But there was no doubt I wasn't alone. Someone was there, hidden in the darkness, watching me. The fear that had been growing inside me exploded into full-blown panic. Something was terribly wrong, and I was right in the middle of it. My entire body froze in fear as I realized the gravity of the situation. There was someone there, hiding in the shadows, watching me. My mind raced, recalling all the horror stories I'd ever heard about late-night deliveries gone wrong. But this wasn't a movie or an urban legend. This was real, and it was happening to me. The man must have realized I had seen him because suddenly there was a burst of movement. He bolted from the bushes, his dark form moving quickly through the darkness. For a moment, I was paralyzed, unable to move or think. Then survival instincts kicked in and I turned to run toward my car. My feet felt heavy, as if I were running in slow motion. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the silent night, mingling with my ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart. I reached the car and threw myself inside, locking the doors immediately. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the keys. I looked around frantically, trying to spot the man again, but he had disappeared into the darkness. The street was empty, with no sign of movement. But that didn't comfort me. He could be anywhere, waiting, watching. I started the engine, ready to get out of there as fast as possible. That's when I noticed something on the ground near where the man had been hiding. It was a backpack. My heart skipped a beat. He must have dropped it in his rush to flee. A part of me screamed to leave, to forget all of this and drive home to safety. But another part, driven by adrenaline and a morbid curiosity, wanted to know more. What if there was something important in that backpack? What if it could give me some clue about what was happening? I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I knew it was probably a terrible idea, but I couldn't just leave now. Not without knowing. With my heart in my throat, I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car again. Every step toward the backpack felt like an eternity. My eyes constantly scanned the darkness, expecting the man to appear at any moment. Finally, I reached the backpack. With trembling hands, I picked it up from the ground. It was surprisingly heavy. I hurried back to the car, locking myself inside once again. Now, with the backpack on the passenger seat, I faced a new decision. Should I open it? What might I find inside? With my heart still racing, I looked at the backpack beside me. It looked harmless enough, just an ordinary object left behind. But I knew its contents could reveal something sinister. My hands shook as I reached for the zipper. Part of me wanted to toss the backpack out the window and drive away, but curiosity and the need to understand what was going on were stronger. Slowly, I began to unzip it, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence of the car. The first thing I saw when I opened the backpack was a metallic glint. My stomach churned as I pulled the object out. It was a knife, long and sharp. My breath caught in my throat. What was someone doing hiding in the bushes with a knife? The implications were terrifying. With my hands shaking even more, I continued to sift through the contents of the backpack. The next item I found was a roll of duct tape. My heart sank even further. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but it was nearly impossible when I pulled out the next item, a length of rope. The combination of these objects painted a horrifying picture. A knife, duct tape, rope. These were tools for a crime, tools to hurt someone. And I was sitting there, holding them in my hands. The panic I had felt earlier turned into a cold terror that spread through my entire body. This wasn't just a strange or unsettling situation. This was potentially deadly. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Who was this man? What was he planning to do? And where was the woman who had ordered the pizza? A terrible thought crossed my mind. What if she was the target? What if I had stumbled into the middle of an attempted kidnapping, or something even worse? The urgency of the situation hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't just leave now. Someone could be in real danger. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone. I knew there was only one thing to do: call the police. As I dialed 911, my eyes kept scanning the darkness around the car. The man could still be nearby, watching, waiting. The voice of the 911 operator sounded in my ear, and I quickly began explaining the situation, my voice trembling with fear and adrenaline. As I spoke, I couldn't help but think about how a simple pizza delivery had turned into something so terrifying. And I knew the night wasn't over yet. As I was frantically relaying the events to the 911 operator, a sudden movement caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, my heart leaping into my throat, fearing the mysterious man had returned. But what I saw shocked me. A woman was running toward my car, her face a mask of pure terror. She kept glancing over her shoulder as if she were being chased. With a start, I realized this must be Rachel, the woman who had ordered the pizza. "Sir, are you still there?" The 911 operator's voice brought me back to reality. I quickly informed them about the woman's arrival and hung up, promising to call back if anything changed. Rachel reached the car, breathless and wide-eyed with fear. I unlocked the doors, letting her in. She collapsed into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind her and nervously looking out the window. Thank you, she gasped, still trying to catch her breath. "He's coming, we need to go." Confused and alarmed, I started the car. "Who's coming? What's going on?" I asked, torn between needing to understand the situation and the urgent desire to flee. Rachel turned to me, tears shining in her eyes. "My ex-boyfriend," she explained, her voice trembling. "He's been stalking me for months. Tonight he threatened to kill me. I ran and ordered the pizza just so I'd have an excuse to get someone to come to the house. I didn't know what else to do." The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. Suddenly, everything made sense. The dark house, the nervous voice on the phone, the man hiding in the bushes. I glanced at the backpack in the back seat, remembering its sinister contents. "He left this behind," I said, pointing to the backpack. Rachel followed my gaze and visibly paled. "Oh my God," she whispered, fear evident in her voice. "He was really going to do it. He was going to hurt me." At that moment, the flashing lights of a police car illuminated the street. The relief I felt was almost overwhelming. As the officers approached, I quickly explained the situation to Rachel. "I called the police when I found the backpack. They're going to help us?" She nodded, tears silently streaming down her face. When the officers reached the car, we stepped out to meet them. The night wasn't over, but for the first time since arriving at that eerie house, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we had avoided a tragedy. The headlights of the police car cut through the dark street, bringing a sense of relief like I'd never experienced before. Two officers stepped out, their faces serious and alert. I approached them with Rachel by my side, feeling both relieved and apprehensive. The taller officer, a middle-aged man with graying hair, was the first to speak. "We got a call about a possible stalking situation. Can you tell us what's going on?" Rachel began to speak, her voice shaking slightly as she explained the situation. She told them about her ex-boyfriend, the threats, and the fear that had driven her to flee her home. As she spoke, I noticed the second officer, a younger woman, scanning the area with a flashlight. Her eyes were sharp, searching for any sign of the stalker. When Rachel finished her story, it was my turn to speak. I recounted the strange delivery, the man I saw in the bushes, and the backpack he left behind. The older officer listened intently, jotting down notes in a small notebook. When I mentioned the backpack, his eyes narrowed. "Where is this backpack now?" he asked. I pointed to my car, and he asked for permission to inspect it. As he examined the contents, I saw his expression grow more serious. He exchanged a significant look with his partner before turning back to us. "You both did the right thing by calling the police," he said. "This situation could have turned very dangerous." The female officer approached Rachel, her voice gentle but firm. "We're going to need you to come down to the station to make a formal statement. We'll also arrange for protective measures." Rachel nodded, looking both relieved and exhausted. The officer then turned to me. "Your quick thinking probably prevented something much worse tonight. We'll need your statement as well, but you can come in tomorrow if you prefer." As the officers continued their investigation, calling in backup and starting a search for Rachel's ex-boyfriend, I stood there watching. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving me exhausted and a little shaky. But along with the fatigue, I felt something else, a sense that somehow I had made a difference. A simple pizza delivery had turned into something much bigger, and I couldn't help but think about how different things might have been if I had just driven away when no one answered the door. The drive home never felt so long. The empty streets of the early morning blurred past my window as I drove on autopilot, my mind still trying to process everything that had happened. The dashboard clock read 3:47 a.m. by the time I finally parked in front of my apartment. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, letting the silence of the night wash over me. It was hard to believe that just a few hours ago, I was making a routine pizza delivery. As I walked into my apartment, I was greeted by the familiar smell of stale coffee and cold pizza, the lingering sense of my job. But that night, those ordinary smells seemed strangely comforting, anchors of normalcy in a world that suddenly felt much more dangerous and unpredictable. I collapsed onto the couch, physically and emotionally drained. I closed my eyes, but the images of the night kept flashing through my mind. The dark house, the man in the bushes, Rachel's terrified face. I grabbed my phone, hesitating for a moment before opening the local news app. There was nothing yet about the incident. Of course, it was too soon, but I couldn't help wondering what the headline might have been if things had gone differently. Woman abducted from home, or worse, body found in residential area. A chill ran down my spine as I thought about what could have happened if I had just driven away when no one answered the door, or if I hadn't noticed the man in the bushes. The realization of the impact my actions had begun to settle in. By being in the right place at the right time, by following my instincts and not ignoring that feeling that something was wrong, I had possibly saved Rachel's life. It was a strange feeling, a mix of relief, pride, and a newfound awareness of how fragile life can be. I had never considered that a simple pizza delivery could have such significant consequences. It made me wonder how many times we pass through similar situations without realizing, how many lives we touch or change without even knowing. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky with soft shades of pink and orange, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. Grateful to be safe, to have been able to help someone in need, and for the new perspective this experience had given me. I knew the memories of that night would stay with me for a long time. A constant reminder of how our actions, no matter how small they seem, can have a huge impact. As I prepared to finally sleep, I made a silent promise to myself. to always trust my instincts and never underestimate the power of being alert and willing to help. After all, you never know when a simple pizza delivery might turn into something much more significant. The sun had barely risen when we left home that cold autumn morning. I, Josh, 16 years old, and my father, Tom, were ready for our traditional hunting trip in the Vermont mountains. The road there was familiar, every bend in the road bringing back memories of past trips. I watched the trees blur by through the car window, a wash of red, orange, and yellow. Normally, this sight would fill me with excitement, but today something felt different. A sense of unease settled in my stomach, a feeling I couldn't explain. We arrived at the entrance to the forest and began unloading our gear. The cold air nipped at my face as I helped my father organize the backpacks. I looked at the dense line of trees ahead of us and felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. The forest, which had always been like a second home to me, suddenly felt strange and intimidating. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, more threatening. I tried to push the feeling aside, telling myself it was just my imagination. "Everything okay, son?" My father's voice snapped me back to reality. I looked at him, noticing a slight crease of worry on his forehead. I forced a smile and nodded, not wanting to burden him with my baseless fears. After all, this was the same forest we had known for years. What could have changed? Still, as we stepped into the tree line, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were closing in around us, like the forest itself was swallowing us whole. The familiar scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs, but even that seemed different. There was an underlying odor I couldn't place, something wild and primal. We walked in silence, our footsteps muffled by the layer of fallen leaves. With each step deeper into the forest, the feeling that something was wrong grew stronger. The trees, once welcoming, now stood like silent sentinels, their twisted branches resembling bony fingers ready to snatch us. I glanced at my father, expecting to see the usual confidence and reassurance. But what I saw surprised me. His eyes were sharp, constantly scanning the area around us. His posture was tense, as if he was ready to react at any moment. That's when I realized it wasn't just me. My father, the man who had always seemed invincible to me, also sensed that something was different. This realization made my heart race. If even my father was worried, then maybe my fears weren't so unfounded. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the silence became more oppressive. Normally, by this time of the morning, the air would be filled with the sounds of wildlife waking up, the chirping of birds, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the distant grunt of a deer. But today there was none of that. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of our own breathing and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. This unnatural quiet put all my senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sudden rustling of leaves made my heart leap. I looked to my father, seeking some sort of comfort or explanation. He must have noticed my unease, because he turned to me with a forced smile. "It's probably just a quiet day, son. Sometimes that happens." But his words felt hollow, as if even he didn't believe them. We continued our trek, venturing into parts of the forest we had never explored before. The trees here seemed older, more twisted, their canopies so dense that barely any sunlight filtered through. The air grew colder and damper as we moved forward, and a thin mist began to form around us, wrapping everything in a ghostly veil. The sensation of being watched intensified with every step, making the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. My father suddenly stopped, raising his hand in a silent signal for me to do the same. I froze, my eyes frantically scanning the area around us. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, but when I looked directly, there was nothing there but the dancing shadows of the trees. My father pointed to a barely visible trail to our right. "Let's head that way," he whispered, his voice tense. I nodded silently, grateful to have a direction to follow. As we followed the narrow trail, The feeling of unease only grew stronger. The forest around us seemed to close in, the trees pressing closer together, their branches intertwining above us like they were trying to trap us. The air grew heavier, thick with a tension that was almost palpable. I wanted to say something, anything to break the suffocating silence, but the words were stuck in my throat. Something told me that making any noise right now would be a terrible mistake. The oppressive silence of the forest was suddenly shattered by a sound that made my blood run cold. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the trees, reverberating in my bones. It wasn't like anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't the grunt of a bear, nor the howl of a wolf. It was something completely different, something primal and fierce that stirred an instinctive fear within me. My father and I froze in place, our eyes meeting in a moment of pure terror. I saw my own fear reflected in his face, normally so calm and confident. He brought a finger to his lips, signaling for me to stay quiet, then pointed to a large tree nearby. I understood immediately and silently moved behind it, pressing my back against the rough bark. The growl came again, closer this time. I could feel my heart pounding so hard I feared the sound would give us away. My eyes scanned the forest frantically, trying to locate the source of the noise. But all I saw were shadows, shifting and dancing in ways that seemed impossible in the still air. My father slowly moved to stand beside me, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands. He was trying to appear calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "Stay close to me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Whatever it is, we can't panic. We need to think clearly." I nodded, unable to form words. As the minutes dragged on, the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. It was as if the forest itself had eyes, observing us from every angle. The growl didn't come again, but somehow, the silence that followed was even more terrifying. I knew deep down that something was out there, something that didn't belong in this world, and it was hunting us. Then I saw it. A dark shape emerged from the shadows between the trees, moving in a way that defied nature. It was large, larger than any animal I had ever seen in the forest. Its body was a grotesque mix of wolf and something else, something my mind refused to fully comprehend. But it was the eyes that paralyzed me with fear, eyes that glowed with a malevolent intelligence, fixed directly on us. I felt my father tense beside me, his breathing becoming quick and shallow. The creature moved with a predatory grace, circling our position slowly. Every movement it made radiated a silent threat. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. It was as if those glowing eyes had hypnotized me, holding me in place. The creature stopped just a few meters away from us, its head tilted to the side as if it were studying us. Its snout twitched, sniffing the air, and a low growl rumbled from its throat. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with any ordinary animal. There was something supernatural, something profoundly wrong about this creature. It was as if it were a physical manifestation of the forest's darkest nightmares. My father slowly raised his rifle, but his hands were shaking so much that I doubted he could aim accurately. The creature must have sensed the movement, because its eyes narrowed and its muscles tensed as if preparing to strike. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity of terror. Then, in the blink of an eye, the creature lunged at us. Everything happened so fast that I barely registered it. I heard the deafening crack of my father's rifle, saw the flash of razor-sharp teeth, smelled the pungent odor of wet fur, and something else, something foul and unnatural. And then we were running like we had never run before, driven by pure terror and the instinct to survive. Our feet barely touched the ground as we sprinted through the forest. Branches whipped at our faces, and roots tried to trip us, but fear pushed us forward. I could hear my father's labored breathing beside me, mixed with the sound of our footsteps crunching over dry leaves. But above all, I could hear the creature's roar behind us, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of hell. We didn't dare look back, but I could feel the creature's presence closing in on us. The foul stench it emitted grew stronger with each passing second. My lungs burned with effort, and my muscles screamed in pain, but terror kept me from slowing down. I knew that stopping would mean certain death. Beside me, my father stumbled over a protruding root. My heart nearly stopped, but he managed to regain his footing and keep running. The forest around us seemed to close in, the trees growing denser and the paths narrower. We leaped over fallen logs, dodged low-hanging branches, our movements guided purely by the instinct to survive. Every few seconds, I heard the sound of jaws snapping at the air just behind us. The creature was toying with us, I realized with horror. It could have caught us at any moment, but it was prolonging our agony. Suddenly, my father grabbed my arm and yanked me sharply to the left. I nearly lost my balance, but managed to regain my footing and followed his lead. I realized he had spotted a steep ravine ahead of us. Without hesitation, we threw ourselves down the slope, rolling and sliding over loose dirt and wet leaves. Rocks and branches scratched at our skin, but we barely felt the pain. All that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between us and that monstrous creature. When we finally reached the bottom of the ravine, we staggered to our feet and kept running. The creature's roar echoed distantly now, reverberating from the top of the ravine. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we had managed to lose it. But as we continued our frantic escape through the dark, unfamiliar forest, I knew we were far from safe. Night was falling, and with it came the fear that the creature would find us again. As the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of our situation became painfully clear. We were completely lost. Our frantic flight had taken us to a part of the forest we didn't recognize. The trees around us all looked the same, tall and menacing, their canopies blocking out most of the remaining daylight. Shadows danced on all sides, and every movement seemed to hide a threat. My father finally stopped, leaning against a tree as he tried to catch his breath. I joined him, my lungs burning and my legs trembling with exhaustion. "We need to find our way back," he gasped between heavy breaths. I nodded silently, though I had no idea how we were going to do that. We had run for so long and in so many different directions that I no longer had any sense of where we were in relation to our starting point. The distant sound of branches snapping made us freeze again. We exchanged panicked glances. The creature was still out there, still hunting us. The growing darkness only heightened our terror. Every shadow could hide those glowing eyes. Every sound could be the prelude to another attack. We started moving again, this time more slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. But fear made it difficult to think clearly or maintain any sense of direction. Hours dragged on as we wandered through the increasingly dark forest. The moon occasionally peeked through the clouds, casting a ghostly silver light through the trees. But instead of comforting us, the light only made the shadows deeper and more threatening. The cold of the night set in, making us shiver. Or maybe it was the constant fear that made us tremble. It was hard to tell the difference at this point. Exhaustion was starting to take its toll, turning every step into a monumental effort. But we didn't dare stop. The sound of heavy footsteps and the occasional guttural growl reminded us constantly of the danger lurking nearby. We were trapped in a never-ending nightmare, lost in a forest that seemed to have come alive, with a creature straight out of hell on our trail. And as the night wore on, the hope of finding a way out seemed more and more distant. After what felt like endless hours of desperate wandering, a glimmer of hope appeared. Through the fog of exhaustion and fear, I recognized a familiar rock formation. My heart leaped. "Dad," I whispered urgently, "I think I know where we are." His tired eyes lit up with a flicker of hope. I pointed to the rock formation, remembering seeing it on previous hunting trips. It was a landmark not far from the main trail. With renewed energy, we quickened our pace, now with a clear purpose. The familiarity of the terrain brought brief relief to the terror that had consumed us for so long. Every rock, every crooked tree began to make sense again, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. And then finally we saw it, the main trail, a dirt path winding through the trees. I never thought I'd be so happy to see a simple stretch of dirt. We followed the trail as quickly as our exhausted legs would allow. The car was close. I could feel it. The thought of safety, of escaping this nightmare, was almost within reach. But we didn't let our guard down for a second. The forest was still oppressively silent, and the feeling of being watched had not left us. The creature was still out there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting. When we finally saw the car, tears of relief welled up in my eyes. We sprinted the last few yards, our bodies protesting the extra effort. My father fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling as he tried to unlock the door. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, we heard the click of the lock, and we scrambled inside, slamming the doors and locking them immediately. For a moment, we just sat there, panting, barely believing we had made it. The silence inside the car was broken only by our ragged breathing. I looked at my father, seeing the same mix of relief and residual fear in his eyes that I felt. He started the engine, and the familiar sound brought a wave of comfort. But as we drove away, I couldn't resist glancing one last time at the dark forest in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw two glowing eyes watching us from the shadows. I shivered and turned forward, praying it was just my imagination. The drive home was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The occasional lights of passing cars and roadside houses felt surreal after our experience in the dark forest. Gradually, the adrenaline wore off, leaving us exhausted and sore. But the fear, that primal terror we had felt, still pulsed in our veins. When we finally arrived home, the familiarity and comfort of our house felt almost strange, as if they belonged to a different life, one that didn't include monsters in the shadows and terror in the woods. My mother greeted us at the door, her face a mix of relief and concern at seeing our disheveled state and the scratches on our skin. We tried to explain what had happened, but the words seemed inadequate to describe the horror we had lived through. That night, lying in my bed, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I heard the guttural growl echoing in my ears. The foul stench of the creature seemed to cling to my nostrils. I knew these memories would haunt me for a long time, maybe forever. I made a silent promise to myself that night. I would never go back to that forest. Never. In the days and weeks that followed, my father and I rarely spoke about what had happened. It was as if by not mentioning it, we could pretend it had just been a terrible nightmare. But I could see in his eyes that he was haunted too. Our hunting rifles remained untouched in the closet, gathering dust. The hunting stories that once filled our family conversations were replaced by more mundane topics. Sometimes, when I look out the window at the distant trees, a shiver runs down my spine. I know that out there, hidden deep in the forest, is something that defies understanding, something that doesn't belong in this world. And I know that we were very lucky to escape with our lives. The innocence of my youth was lost in that forest, along with my belief in the natural order of things. Now I know that there are mysteries in the world that are better left unsolved and places where it's best never to set foot again. The forest can keep its secrets. As for me, I will keep my promise never to return. The wind whispered dark secrets as I stared at the silhouette of the abandoned house atop the hill. My best friend, Zach, stood beside me. His face lit up with an eager grin that starkly contrasted with the chill running down my spine. Windsor, our small town, had always been a quiet place, but the rumors about that haunted house were as persistent as weeds, growing and spreading over the years. I never paid much attention to those stories, dismissing them as mere tales to scare kids and entertain bored townsfolk. Zach and I had been friends for as long as I could remember, bonded by an insatiable curiosity and a shared skepticism about the supernatural. When he suggested we explore the house, I didn't hesitate to agree. After all, we were young, fearless, and above all rational. There was nothing that could scare us. Certainly not an old, abandoned building with a few legends attached to it. In our minds, it was just another adventure, a chance to prove that the town's fears were unfounded. As we approached the base of the hill, I recalled the countless warnings we'd heard over the years. Elderly folks shaking their heads in disapproval, mothers pulling their children away whenever they passed the road leading to the property, even the local priest giving veiled sermons about the dangers of impure places. All of this only fueled our determination to uncover the mystery and expose the truth behind the rumors. "Are you ready for this, Miles?" Zach asked, his voice brimming with excitement. I nodded, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling forming in the pit of my stomach. It was just nerves, I told myself, perfectly natural when about to enter a forbidden place. It had nothing to do with the stories of nighttime screams, inexplicable lights, or the shadows some swore they'd seen moving behind the broken windows. We started our ascent, twigs snapping beneath our feet as we waded through the thick vegetation covering the hill. The air seemed to grow heavier with each step, as though the atmosphere itself was trying to keep us from reaching our destination. But we were young and stubborn, determined to prove our point. Little did we know that night would change our lives forever, and that the secrets the house held were far darker and far more real than we could have ever imagined. As we drew closer to the house, a growing unease began to grip me. What had initially seemed like an exciting adventure now felt far more sinister. The structure before us was desolate. Cracked walls covered in vines that looked like snakes, ready to strangle what was left of the building. The windows, many of them shattered, reflected the moonlight like empty eyes watching us. The silence was oppressive, almost tangible. Not even the wind dared to whisper through the trees surrounding the property. It was as though we had stepped into a bubble where time and sound no longer existed. Zach, always the braver of the two of us, stepped forward, breaking the momentary spell that held me frozen in place. His face still wore that confident smile, but I noticed a slight tremor in his hands. "Come on, Miles," he whispered, his voice unervingly loud in the deathly quiet. "Don't tell me you're scared now." I wanted to say yes, that I was scared, that something about this place was screaming at us to turn back and never look back. But pride and curiosity held me back. I swallowed hard and followed my friend toward the entrance. The air around us seemed to grow colder with every step. It was summer, but I felt as though we were stepping into a freezer. My skin prickled, and it wasn't just from the cold. There was something else there, a presence I couldn't explain but could feel. It was as if the house was alive, breathing slowly, evaluating us as we approached. We stopped in front of the front door, a massive wooden structure that surprisingly was still standing. We exchanged a glance, a last chance to turn back, to retreat to the safety of our normal lives. But we were too young, too foolish to recognize the danger awaiting us. With a creak that echoed throughout the property, Zach pushed the door open, and we took our first step into the nightmare. The inside of the house was a testament to abandonment and decay. Moonlight filtered through the broken windows, revealing a scene of chaos. Broken furniture scattered across the floor, peeling wallpaper, and a suffocating smell of mold and rot. Our footsteps stirred up clouds of dust, making the air even heavier and harder to breathe. Zach pulled a flashlight from his pocket, the beam of light dancing across the stained walls and revealing details the darkness had mercifully hidden. Shards of broken mirrors reflected the light erratically, creating the illusion of movement in the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, as though every dark corner hid hungry eyes tracking our every move. "Check this out," Zach murmured, pointing to a series of deep scratches on the wood of a door. "Looks like someone or something tried to claw its way out." He chuckled, but the sound was forced, echoing strangely in the stillness of the house. I couldn't share in his attempt at humor. Every new detail we discovered only intensified my discomfort. We continued exploring the ground floor, passing through a living room where time seemed to have stopped. A broken clock on the wall read 3:33, its gears silent for decades. Dusty photographs stared at us from crooked frames, their once happy faces now twisted into grim warnings. In one corner, a decrepit piano sat with yellowed keys, like rotten teeth in a macabre grin. The kitchen was even more disturbing. Broken dishes littered the floor, as if they had been thrown in a fit of rage. The rusted fridge stood slightly ajar, and I quickly averted my gaze, fearing what might have been left to rot inside. It was then that I heard, or thought I heard, a whisper coming from somewhere above us. I turned to Zach, ready to suggest that maybe it was time to leave, but he was already heading for the stairs, his curiosity overpowering any sense of self-preservation. Zach had one foot on the first step when I grabbed his arm, my voice a hushed plea. "Maybe we should go. We've seen enough, don't you think?" But my friend just smiled, that confident grin that always got him, and by extension me, into trouble. "Come on, Miles. Don't tell me you're scared of a few old creaky stairs." His tone was teasing, but I could sense a hint of tension beneath the bravado. Nevertheless, he started to climb, and I reluctantly followed. Each step groaned beneath our weight, as if the house itself was protesting our intrusion. As we ascended, the air seemed to grow denser, thick with an acrid smell I couldn't place. It was as though we were stepping into another world, leaving behind the relative comfort of the familiar ground floor and entering a realm where the usual rules didn't apply. Shadows flickered at the edges of our vision, retreating whenever we tried to focus on them directly. Zach's flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing more of those deep scratches, now forming patterns that almost looked like words in a language I didn't recognize, but that sent chills down my spine. We reached the top of the stairs and were met with a long corridor. Closed doors lined both sides, their surfaces marked by years of neglect. The once elegant wallpaper now hung in strips, revealing dark stains beneath. Zach swept the flashlight over each door, as if deciding which one to open first. I wanted to scream, to beg him to turn back and run from that cursed house, but the words stuck in my throat. The sensation of being watched, which had nagged at me since we entered, was now almost unbearable. My friend began to move down the hallway, his hand reaching for the nearest doorknob. That's when I felt it, a presence, a shift in the atmosphere that's hard to describe. It was as if the air around us had become electrified, charged with a malevolent energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Zach must have felt it too, because he froze, his hand hovering just inches from the door. We looked at each other, fear finally visible in his eyes, mirroring the terror I felt. Then, breaking the oppressive silence, came a sound that froze the blood in my veins, a low, deep growl coming from one of the rooms ahead of us. It wasn't like any animal I knew. It was something more, something that shouldn't exist in this world. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, to flee that accursed place, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Zach, however, seemed to regain some of his courage. With a determined look, he grabbed the doorknob of the nearest room and slowly turned it. The growling intensified the moment Zach began to open the door. It was a sound that reverberated not just in the air, but within us, sinking deep into our bones and awakening our darkest fears. I wanted to scream at Zach to stop, to not open that door, but my voice had vanished, swallowed by the terror that now gripped every part of me. The corridor around us seemed to warp and ripple, the shadows coming alive, writhing in a grotesque dance along the peeling walls. The air grew even heavier, thick with a malevolence so palpable it felt as if we could touch it. Zach hesitated for a moment, his hand visibly trembling on the doorknob. I could see the conflict in his eyes, fear battling with curiosity, the instinct to survive warring with the desire to uncover the unknown. For a brief moment, I thought he would pull back, that we'd finally realize the danger we were in and run from that damn place. But then, with a quick and decisive motion, he pushed the door open. What we saw inside shattered any sense of reality we had clung to. The darkness in the room was unlike anything we had ever seen. It wasn't just an absence of light, but something alive, pulsing, devouring the beam of Zach's flashlight as though it fed on it. In the center of that unnatural void, two eyes glowed, not from the reflection of our light, but from within, radiating a sinister light of their own. They were ancient eyes, filled with a twisted wisdom and an insatiable hunger. As our eyes adjusted to the gloom, we could make out the faint outlines of a figure, though it defied description. It wasn't entirely human, nor fully animal, an abomination that should never have existed in our world. The creature shifted, its body a mass of shadows and impossible angles. The growl morphed into words, if you could call those guttural sounds words. It spoke with a voice that carried the weight of eons, reverberating not just in the room, but in our minds. "Leave," it commanded, the word laden with a threat so profound that I felt my legs buckle. The stench of decay and something far older, far more malevolent, assaulted our senses, making my stomach churn. Zach, ever the braver of the two, took a step forward, as though entranced by the infernal sight before us. It was his movement that broke the spell that had kept me frozen in place. I grabbed Zach's arm with all the strength I could muster and yanked him backward, out of the room. The creature, I have no better word for it, let out a sound that was part roar, part laughter, a promise of horrors beyond our comprehension if we dared stay. I needed no more encouragement. Dragging Zach behind me, I bolted down the hallway toward the stairs, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Behind us, I could hear something moving, something pursuing us, an evil presence that threatened to consume us if we slowed down even for a second. The room we had just left seemed to vomit darkness into the corridor, a living shadow that snaked across the floor like tendrils of smoke. Zach finally snapped out of his trance and began running alongside me, his face a mask of pure terror. The entity we had glimpsed was now fully emerging, a monstrosity of twisted limbs and writhing shadows, its malevolent eyes fixed on us as we raced for our lives. The air around us grew icy, our breath forming clouds in the freezing air as we fought to escape. The creature's voice echoed behind us, no longer a simple growl, but a cacophony of whispers and screams that seemed to come from all directions at once. Words in forgotten languages mingled with promises of eternal torment if we were caught. The floor beneath us seemed to ripple, as though the house itself was alive and trying to trap us. The walls pulsed with a sickly light, briefly revealing contorted faces, twisted in agony, embedded in the wood like damned souls. We reached the stairs, nearly falling in our haste to descend. Each step groaned and creaked beneath our weight, threatening to collapse at any moment. The evil presence behind us grew stronger, an overwhelming wave of pure terror that threatened to engulf us. I glanced back for a split second and wished I hadn't. The entity had transformed into something even more horrific, a grotesque amalgamation of everything we fear in the dark, with sharp teeth glinting in a mouth far too large for its distorted face. Its claws raked the walls, leaving trails of a black, viscous substance that seemed to eat away at the wood. We stumbled down the final steps, collapsing onto the ground floor in a heap. The pain of the fall was momentarily overshadowed by the sheer terror driving us forward. The shadows around us twisted and writhed, spectral hands reaching out to pull us back into the depths of the house. The furniture, once scattered across the floor, now seemed to move of its own accord, blocking our path to the exit. The piano we had seen earlier began to play a discordant, macabre tune, its keys moving on their own, filling the air with a symphony from hell. We struggled to our feet, grabbing onto each other for support and strength. The front door, our only hope of escape, seemed miles away. Every step we took toward it, it seemed to stretch further into the distance. The creature's laughter echoed throughout the house, a demented cackle promising that we would never escape, that we were trapped in this nightmare forever. But desperation gave us a strength we didn't know we had. With one final, desperate effort, we hurled ourselves toward the door, our hands reaching for the freedom that seemed just out of reach. Our fingers grasped the doorknob at the exact moment we felt the creature's icy breath on our necks. With a desperate yank, we pulled the door open and tumbled out into the night, collapsing onto the damp grass of the front yard. The cool night air had never felt so sweet, so liberating. But we didn't dare stop. Even outside the house, we could feel the malevolent presence stretching toward us, trying to drag us back in. The trees around the property seemed to bend toward us, their branches like bony fingers reaching out to snatch us back into that hellish nightmare. We ran down the hill, our legs moving almost of their own accord. The moon, which had once illuminated our path, now seemed to have been swallowed by dark clouds, plunging everything into near total darkness. We tripped over roots and stones, our bodies scraped and bruised, but fear kept us numb to the pain. Behind us, we could hear the enraged howls of the creature, a mixture of fury and frustration at having lost its prey. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, as though the forest itself had come alive and was screaming at us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the road that led back to town. Only then did we dare to look back. The house at the top of the hill was shrouded in an unnatural mist, its windows glowing with a sickly red light. For a moment, I swear I saw a massive, distorted figure in the window of the room where we had encountered the creature, its eyes still fixed on us, silently promising that this wasn't over. A cold wind blew, carrying with it whispers of threats and promises of return. We continued running down the road, our lungs burning, our muscles screaming in protest, but the fear kept pushing us forward. The lights of the town had never seemed so welcoming, so safe. As we neared the first houses, the feeling of being pursued finally began to fade. Still, we didn't stop until we reached the town square, collapsing in exhaustion near the gazebo. We lay there for a long time, gasping for breath, unable to speak, our minds still trying to process the horror we had witnessed. It was Zach who finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse and trembling. What was that?" he asked, though he knew I had no answer. I looked at my friend, noticing how he seemed to have aged years in that single night. His eyes, once filled with curiosity and bravado, were now haunted, carrying the weight of knowledge of things that should not exist in our world. I realized that my own reflection in the glass of a nearby store showed the same tormented expression. That night, we lost more than our innocence. We lost our belief in a world that was orderly and understandable. And deep in my heart, I knew that it wasn't truly over. The entity from the house on the hill was now a part of us, and I feared that one day it would come to claim us. The days following our horrific experience at the abandoned house were a blur of nightmares and paranoia. Zach and I barely spoke about what had happened, as though voicing our memories would somehow make them more real, more tangible. But the silence between us was deafening, loaded with the mutual understanding of the terror we had faced. Sometimes I would catch Zach glancing over his shoulder, his eyes wide and watchful, as though expecting to see that dark entity emerging from the shadows at any moment. I couldn't blame him. I did the same. Nights were the worst. Every time I closed my eyes, I was haunted by visions of those glowing eyes in the darkness, of that impossible form twisting as it chased us. The sound of that ancient, malevolent voice echoed in my dreams, whispering promises of eternal torment. I'd wake up drenched in cold sweat, my heart racing, convinced for a moment that the creature was in my room, waiting to drag me back into that hell. Even when the daylight came, bringing with it a false sense of security, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, followed by something that didn't belong to this world. The town of Windsor, once so familiar and welcoming, now felt strange and threatening. Every dark alley, every elongated shadow at dusk, seemed to hide sinister secrets. The looks from the locals, which we had so easily dismissed before, now seemed loaded with meaning. Did they know? Had they always known what lurked in that house on the hill? The stories and warnings we had once laughed off as superstition now came back to haunt us, every word taking on a new and terrifying significance in light of what we had witnessed. Zach and I made a silent pact never to speak of that night again, much less return to that cursed place. But the vow felt fragile, inadequate in the face of the magnitude of what we had encountered. The entity we had faced wasn't something that could simply be forgotten or left behind. Its presence lingered, a shadow at the edges of our minds, an invisible weight on our shoulders. Sometimes, when the wind blew from the direction of the hill, I swear I could hear echoes of that otherworldly growl, a reminder that the evil we had stirred still lay in wait. Years passed, and Zach and I eventually went our separate ways, both of us leaving Windsor behind the first chance we got. But distance wasn't enough to erase the scars left by that night. Every so often, I get a late-night call from Zach, his voice trembling on the other end, asking if I still dreamed of those eyes in the dark. And I always told him the truth. Yes, I did, because I knew that some experiences mark you forever, warping the fabric of your reality in ways you can't undo. The house on the hill may have been left behind, but the horror we found there follows us still, an ever-present shadow, a constant reminder that there are things in this world, and perhaps beyond it, that defy our understanding and threaten our sanity. And deep down, I know that one day, somehow, that entity will come for us to finish what it started on that fateful night in Windsor. The summer sun was shining brightly as we left the campus behind, shedding the overwhelming weight of the hardest semester we had ever faced. Liam, was behind the wheel with Noah in the passenger seat adjusting the GPS for our mountain adventure. In the back seat, Haley and Brianna were singing off-key along with the radio, their voices a blend of relief and excitement. The stress of finals and endless projects seemed to melt away like fog in the heat of the day, replaced by the promise of a weekend of pure freedom in nature. The city slowly receded, skyscrapers giving way to rolling green hills and eventually to the towering mountains that would be our refuge for the next few days. The air grew cleaner with each passing mile, and I could feel the tension in my shoulders easing. Noah was enthusiastically talking about the trails he planned to explore, his eyes gleaming with the excitement of a born adventurer. Haley, our amateur photographer, already had her camera in hand, capturing the ever-changing landscape through the car window. Brianna, always the voice of reason in our group, was checking our supply list for the 100th time, making sure we hadn't forgotten anything essential. Her meticulous care was reassuring, a reminder that even though we were escaping civilization for a few days, we were well prepared for whatever might come. Laughter and jokes filled the car, creating a bubble of happiness that seemed impenetrable. As we approached our destination, the road became more winding, twisting between ancient trees that seemed to touch the sky. The fresh mountain air flooded the car through the open windows, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. It was as if nature itself was welcoming us, inviting us to leave the world of concrete behind and immerse ourselves in its serenity. Excitement buzzed between us as we finally spotted the sign for the camping area. We exchanged looks of pure joy, eager to set up our tents, start a campfire, and spend the night telling stories under a star-filled sky, free from the light pollution of the city. At that moment, we were just four friends ready to create memories that would last a lifetime, unaware that fate had much different plans for our little adventure. Nightfall came quickly as we continued our journey along the winding road to the campsite. The shadows of the trees stretched out, creating a dance of light and darkness across the windshield. The lively conversation from earlier had faded into a comfortable silence, broken only by the soft hum of the radio and the occasional comment on the wild beauty surrounding us. I kept my focus on the road ahead, gripping the wheel tightly, aware of the treacherous curves that followed one after the other. It was on one of those curves that everything changed in an instant. An animal, perhaps a deer, suddenly appeared in front of us, its eyes reflecting the headlights like two balls of fire. Instinctively, I yanked the wheel to avoid the collision, my heart racing in my chest. Time seemed to slow as the car skidded, the tires losing their grip on the road dampened by the evening dew. I heard the startled and terrified screams of my friends, saw the panic in Noah's eyes beside me, but there was nothing I could do but struggle to regain control of the vehicle. Everything that followed was a blur of motion and sound. The car spun violently, veering off the road and plunging into the dark forest. Branches and foliage slapped against the windows with a deafening noise. For a brief moment, I had the strange sensation that we were flying, suspended in the air like in a bizarre dream. Then came the impact. The crunch of metal against a massive tree reverberated through my body. The airbag exploded in my face with the force of a punch, and a sharp pain spread through my chest. The world around me fragmented into disconnected flashes. The sound of shattering glass. The acrid smell of burning rubber and engine fluids. The metallic taste of blood in my mouth. I tried to move, to call out for my friends, but my body wouldn't respond. Darkness began to creep in at the edges of my vision, deeper and more impenetrable than the night around us. I fought to stay conscious, desperate to know if my friends were okay, but it was a battle I was destined to lose. My last coherent thought before succumbing to the darkness was a mixture of fear and regret. Fear for what might happen to us, lost and injured in the middle of the forest. Regret that I had been the one driving, that I hadn't been more careful, that I had put the lives of the people I loved most at risk. Then, like a candle being snuffed out, my consciousness faded, and I was swallowed by an absolute void, not knowing if I would ever wake up again. Awareness returned to me like waves crashing on the shore, each one bringing with it fragments of reality that I struggled to comprehend. The first thing I noticed was the silence, an oppressive silence, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I opened my eyes slowly, expecting to be hit with the pain of the accident, but to my surprise, I felt nothing. I was standing in the dark forest, the night air cool against my skin. For a moment, I thought it had all been a terrible nightmare, until my eyes adjusted to the gloom and I saw the scene in front of me. The car was there, a twisted mass of metal wrapped around an imposing tree. Broken glass reflected the faint moonlight, creating a sinister mosaic on the forest floor. My heart raced as I saw the motionless forms inside the wrecked vehicle. With growing horror, I recognized Noah, still in the passenger seat, his head hanging at an unnatural angle. In the back seat, Haley and Brianna were entangled, as if they had tried to protect each other at the moment of impact. None of them were moving. I screamed their names, my voice echoing strangely in the night, but there was no response. I ran toward the car, determined to help them, to do something, anything. That's when I heard my name called from behind me. I turned and saw Noah, Haley, and Brianna standing in the clearing, looking at me with a mix of confusion and fear. I looked back at the car, and there they were, still trapped in the wreckage. My mind spun, unable to process what my eyes were seeing. "Liam, what's happening?" Brianna's voice trembled, filled with fear and uncertainty. I looked down at my own hands, noticing for the first time how they seemed almost translucent in the moonlight. A wave of nausea hit me as the reality of the situation began to sink in. We weren't just outside the car, we were outside our own bodies. Panic began to rise in my chest, a suffocating feeling that threatened to consume me. We huddled together, a group of lost souls, staring helplessly at our broken bodies inside the car. The silence of the forest now seemed to mock us, a constant reminder of how isolated we were. Unanswered questions hung in the air between us. Were we dead? Was this the afterlife? Or were we trapped in some kind of shared nightmare? The uncertainty was almost as terrifying as the sight of our own lifeless bodies. As the night wore on, the reality of our situation began to settle over us like a heavy cloak of despair, threatening to smother us in the darkness of the forest. The hours that followed were a blur of denial and frantic attempts to understand our situation. We tried to touch our bodies, shake them, do anything to wake them, but our hands passed straight through the solid matter as if we were made of mist. Frustration and fear grew with each failed attempt. Noah, always the most logical among us, tried to rationalize what was happening, suggesting that maybe we were having some kind of collective near-death experience. But the explanation felt flimsy in the face of the surreal reality surrounding us. Haley was the first to say out loud what we all feared. "I think we're dead." Her voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. The words hung between us, heavy and irrefutable. I looked at my friends, seeing the same terror I felt reflected in their eyes. Guilt consumed me. I had been driving. It had been my responsibility to keep them safe. Now we were stuck in this limbo, neither alive nor dead because of me. Brianna, always the most spiritual of the group, suggested that maybe we were being tested, that this could be some kind of purgatory. Maybe we have to do something, resolve something, so we can move on, she said, her voice trembling slightly at the end. The idea of moving on sent a shiver through all of us. Where would we go? What awaited us beyond this in-between state? The fear of the unknown was almost as paralyzing as the shock of our current situation. As we debated our theories, I began to notice subtle changes around us. The forest, which had seemed like a static, silent backdrop, was beginning to take on an ethereal quality. The shadows seemed to move in ways that couldn't be explained by the wind, and I occasionally caught glimpses of indistinct shapes out of the corner of my eye, disappearing as soon as I tried to focus on them. It was as if the veil between worlds was thinning, allowing us to glimpse something beyond our reality. Time lost all meaning in this state. We had no way of knowing if hours or days had passed since the accident. Our bodies in the car remained unchanged, as if time had stopped for them. But for us, in our ethereal form, each moment stretched into an eternity of doubt and fear. We began to question not just whether we were dead, but what it meant to be alive. The boundaries between existence and non-existence, between reality and nightmare, became increasingly blurred. And in the midst of all this uncertainty, one question persisted. If we were truly dead, why were we still here? What was the purpose of this limbo? And more importantly, was there a way out? As the night deepened, the forest around us seemed to come alive in a disturbing way. The shadows between the trees grew denser, almost tangible, as if they could swallow us at any moment. The oppressive silence gave way to strange, unsettling sounds, branches cracking without wind, distant whispers that didn't belong to any human voice. Each noise made us huddle closer together, seeking comfort in the proximity of our companions in this surreal journey. The darkness seemed to move with a will of its own, snaking between the trees and pooling in corners where the moonlight couldn't reach. At times, I could swear I saw eyes glinting in the shadows, watching us with a hungry curiosity. I tried to convince myself it was just my overactive imagination, fueled by fear and uncertainty. But the nervous glances from my friends told me I wasn't the only one feeling like something in the forest was watching us. "Do you feel that?" Noah asked, his normally confident voice now trembling slightly. "It's like the forest is alive." Haley nodded, her wide eyes constantly scanning our surroundings. "It's not just the forest," she whispered. "It feels like we're being hunted." Haley's words voiced the fear we were all feeling but had been reluctant to admit. Something was out there, in the shadows, and somehow we knew it wasn't benevolent. Brianna, always the most sensitive among us, seemed particularly affected by the oppressive environment. She was visibly trembling, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to protect herself from a cold we couldn't feel in our ethereal state. "Something is wrong here," she murmured, more to herself than to us. "This place is not natural. We're not supposed to be here." Her words echoed a truth we all felt deep in our bones. We were in a place that didn't belong to the world of the living, but it wasn't entirely the realm of the dead either. As the night wore on, the sensation of being watched, of being prey in a game whose rules we didn't understand, intensified. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees bending as if they wanted to trap us. The air grew heavier, charged with a malevolent energy that made our ethereal bodies tingle uncomfortably. We were trapped in a nightmare from which we couldn't wake, and the worst part was the growing certainty that our ordeal was only just beginning. As time passed, though it was impossible to say how much, the feeling that we were being drawn into something darker and more unknown grew stronger. It was as if an invisible force was pulling us into the depths of an abyss, and our struggle to resist became increasingly desperate. We clung to each other, both physically and emotionally, fearing that if we let go, we would be lost forever in this realm of shadows. The doubt about our own existence began to gnaw at our minds. Were we really dead? Or were we trapped in some kind of purgatory, condemned to wander eternally through this sinister forest? The uncertainty was almost as terrifying as the darkness surrounding us. Each of us dealt with the fear in different ways. Noah tried to stay calm, seeking logical explanations for our situation. Haley alternated between moments of hysteria and fierce determination. Brianna prayed silently, her lips moving in desperate prayers. I felt torn between the desire to protect my friends and the paralyzing terror that threatened to consume me. The guilt over the accident weighed on me like an anchor, dragging me into the depths of despair. But at the same time, I knew I had to be strong to find a way to get us out of this situation. "We have to fight this," I said, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. "Whatever's trying to drag us down, we can't let it win." But fight what? The enemy was invisible, intangible, and yet terrifyingly real. At times, I felt as if icy hands were gripping my soul, trying to pull it from my being. Other times, it felt like we were sinking into quicksand, being dragged down by an unstoppable force. We tried to move, to escape the clearing where the accident had happened. But the more we struggled to leave, the more we seemed to end up back in the same place, as if the forest itself was holding us prisoner. The struggle was both physical and mental. We had to resist not only the force trying to drag us down, but also the despair that threatened to overtake our minds. Each moment was a battle to hold on to sanity, to not succumb to the overwhelming fear surrounding us. And behind it all, there was a question that none of us dared to ask aloud. What if there was no way out? What if this was our final fate? Wandering forever in this limbo between life and death, fighting forces we couldn't understand or defeat. Waking up was like emerging from deep, dark waters. The first thing I felt was pain, deep, throbbing pain radiating from every part of my body. My eyes opened slowly, blinking against the harsh fluorescent light that seemed to pierce my skull. The sterile smell and constant beeping of machines told me I was in a hospital before my vision even fully focused. For a moment, I was disoriented, the memory of the dark forest still vivid in my mind, brutally contrasting with the clinical reality around me. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy and awkward, as if it didn't fully belong to me. A nurse noticed that I was awake and quickly approached, her face a mix of relief and professional concern. "Welcome back," she said softly, adjusting something on my monitor. "You've been unconscious for a few days. We were afraid you wouldn't wake up." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Days? It felt like we had spent an eternity in that hellish forest. With a dry throat and hoarse voice, I managed to ask about my friends. The nurse smiled gently, gesturing to the beds around me. There they were, Noah, Haley, and Brianna, all battered and hooked up to machines, but alive. The relief I felt was so intense that tears began to roll down my face. They were alive. We had all survived. The guilt that had consumed me in the forest lessened slightly, though I knew it would take time to fully overcome. In the days that followed, as we slowly recovered, we shared our experiences. To my surprise and confusion, each of us had vivid, eerily similar memories of the time we spent on the other side. The dark forest, the feeling of being hunted, the battle against invisible forces. All of it was common in our recollections. The doctors talked about hallucinations caused by trauma and the near-death experience, but to us it felt too real, too visceral to be just the product of injured minds. Despite the relief of being alive and safe, something still didn't feel right. Sometimes, when the hospital lights dimmed in the late afternoon, I swore I saw shadows moving in the corners of the room, heard whispers that didn't belong to this world. And from the looks we exchanged silently, I knew my friends felt the same. We had survived, yes, but something had fundamentally changed in us. The line between life and death, between this world and the next, no longer seemed so clear or definitive. Weeks passed, and gradually we were discharged from the hospital, returning to our normal lives. But normality now felt like a strange, elusive concept. The memories of what we had experienced in the forest, or what we thought we had experienced, haunted us constantly. We met regularly, not just to support each other in our physical recovery, but also to try to make sense of our shared experience. We were the only ones who could truly understand what each of us was going through. Noah, always the rational one, tried to find scientific explanations for what had happened. He talked about near-death experiences, about how the brain can create elaborate hallucinations in moments of extreme stress. But even he admitted that there was something more to our experience, something that defied simple explanations. Haley threw herself into research on the paranormal and out-of-body experiences, desperate for answers that conventional science couldn't provide. Brianna, meanwhile, turned more deeply to her faith, seeking comfort and explanations in religious and spiritual texts. As for me, I found myself constantly torn between the desire to forget and the obsessive need to understand. During the day, I tried to focus on recovery, on resuming my life where it had left off. But at night, the nightmares came, visions of the dark forest, the sensation of being watched and hunted, the terrible certainty that something still awaited us on the other side. I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, unable to fully distinguish between dream and reality. The impact on our lives was deep and lasting. Relationships with family and friends who hadn't shared our experience became strained and distant. How could we explain the unexplainable? How could we make others understand that we had glimpsed beyond the veil of death and come back changed? Some days, I found myself questioning whether we had truly returned or if we were still trapped in that dark place, living an illusion of normality. As time went on, the doubt persisted like a constant shadow in our lives. We had survived the accident, yes, but a part of us still seemed trapped in that ethereal forest. Sometimes, in moments of silence or the darkness of night, I felt that familiar presence, the sensation of something watching, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that our journey wasn't truly over. Whatever we had encountered that fateful night was still out there, patient and relentless. And a part of me feared, or perhaps longed, for the day we would meet it again, when we would finally discover the truth about what exists beyond the boundaries of life and death. The sound of my footsteps echoed through the empty hospital corridors, each echo amplifying the sense of loneliness that enveloped me that night. I, Ethan, a simple night shift worker, walked slowly toward my station, feeling the oppressive weight of the silence that dominated the environment. With every step, my unease grew, not just because of the unusual quiet, but mainly due to how close my post was to the morgue. It felt as though the silent presence of the dead seeped through the hallways, whispering secrets I didn't want to hear. As I neared my station, I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting strange shadows on the sterile white walls. I tried to focus on the tasks ahead, organizing files, reviewing reports, preparing materials for the day's shift. But my mind kept drifting back to that door at the end of the corridor, a thin barrier between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. It was irrational, I knew, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond that door was watching me, waiting. The clock on the wall read 11:30 p.m. when I finally sat down at my desk. The occasional beep of distant machines and the low hum of the ventilation system were the only sounds breaking the sepulchral silence. I picked up a stack of papers, determined to bury myself in work and push away the dark thoughts haunting me. But every time I turned a page, my eyes were drawn to the dark corridor leading to the morgue. The darkness seemed to shift, as if it were alive, pulsing with secrets I dared not imagine. As the night dragged on, my unease grew. The air seemed to thicken, heavy with an invisible tension that made my nerves tingle. I tried distracting myself with mundane tasks, organizing files, checking emails, even cleaning my desk over and over. But nothing could shake the growing sense that something was wrong. It was as if the entire hospital was holding its breath, waiting for something I couldn't understand. And there I was, trapped between the relentless ticking of the clock and the oppressive silence of death. As the hours stretched on, I began to question my sanity. Was the isolation of the night shift finally getting to me? Or was something more sinister lurking in the shadows of this place? Every unexpected noise made me jump. Every movement in the shadows sent my heart racing. And yet I couldn't stop looking at that dark corridor, feeling as though, at any moment, something or someone would emerge from the shadows, bringing with it the secrets the night so jealously guarded. It was around 2 a.m. when I saw him for the first time. A movement in the corner of my eye made me snap my head toward the corridor. There he was, a dark figure silently gliding across the linoleum floor. My heart leaped into my throat as I watched, paralyzed, the stranger moving with an unnatural grace. He wasn't a patient, of that I was certain. His posture was too upright, his walk too deliberate, and there was something about his movements that reminded me of a predator stalking its prey. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm my frayed nerves. Probably just a lost visitor, I told myself, though I knew it was a lie. No one should be wandering the halls at this hour. I watched in silence as the man disappeared around the corner, heading toward the morgue. A shiver ran down my spine at the thought of what he might want there. Minutes passed, each second stretching into an eternity as I waited, tense, for his return. When he reappeared, my blood turned to ice. He was coming directly toward me, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. As he approached, I saw his face for the first time, and I wished I hadn't. His skin was pale, almost translucent under the fluorescent lights, and his eyes were empty, like bottomless pits. He smiled when he saw me, but it was a smile that didn't reach those dead eyes, and I felt as if I were looking at a mask, not a human face. "Good evening," he said, his voice surprisingly soft and melodic. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry as paper. "See, can I help you?" I stammered, hating the tremor in my voice. He tilted his head, as if considering my question. "Actually," he replied slowly, "I think you can. I'm looking for the morgue. Could you grant me access?" My heart, already racing, now felt like it would burst out of my chest. Who was this man, and what did he want in the morgue in the middle of the night? "I'm sorry, sir," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "The morgue is a restricted area. I can't let anyone in without proper authorization." The man's smile faltered for a moment, a shadow passing through his eyes. "I understand," he said softly. "Perhaps we can come to an arrangement." And that was when he made the offer that would change everything, a proposition that filled me with a dread I had never felt before. "What if I offered you compensation for your discretion?" The man spoke, his voice now a seductive whisper that made my stomach churn. He pulled a wad of cash from his pocket, the green bills standing out obscenely against the pallor of his hand. "All I ask is 1 hour alone in there. No one needs to know." I stared at the money, my brain struggling to process what was happening. The request was so absurd, so completely out of the question, that for a moment I wondered if I was having a particularly vivid nightmare. It was at that moment that Lucas, my night shift colleague, appeared from the other corridor. He stopped abruptly when he saw the stranger, his eyes widening with a mix of surprise and apprehension. The man turned slowly, his gaze now fixed on Lucas, and I saw my colleague visibly pale. "What's going on here?" Lucas asked, his voice tense. Before I could respond, the stranger spoke. "Just making a business proposal to your colleague here. Perhaps you'd be interested as well." The tension in the air was palpable, so thick it felt hard to breathe. Lucas and I exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing between us. We both knew that whatever was happening, it was wrong, dangerous, something far beyond a simple breach of protocol. "Sir," Lucas said, his voice trembling slightly, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The morgue isn't open to visitors, especially at this hour." The man's smile vanished completely, his face becoming a cold, expressionless mask. "You don't understand the opportunity you're missing," he said, his voice now laced with a veiled threat. "Think carefully. No one needs to know. You two could make more in one night than you earn in a month." A wave of nausea washed over me. What could this man possibly want to do in the morgue that was worth so much money? And why was he so desperate to get in? The implications were too horrific to contemplate, and yet my mind couldn't stop imagining increasingly disturbing scenarios. Lucas stepped forward, placing himself between me and the stranger. "Our answer is no," he said firmly. "Now, please leave before we call security." For a moment, I thought the man was going to attack. His eyes flashed with a cold fury, and his fingers twitched as if they wanted to close around Lucas's throat. But then, just as quickly as the anger had come, it disappeared, replaced by that empty, unsettling smile. "As you wish," the man said, his voice once again soft and controlled. Perhaps I misjudged the situation. He pocketed the money with a fluid motion, his eyes never leaving ours. "Good night, gentlemen." And with that, he turned and began walking slowly toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the silent corridor. Lucas and I stood frozen, watching his figure fade into the distance, unable to believe what had just happened. When the man finally disappeared from view, I let out the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Lucas turned to me, his face pale and tense. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, as if afraid the stranger could still hear. I shook my head, unable to find words to describe the terror still coursing through my veins. "I don't know," I finally managed to say, "but we need to report this. Now." Lucas nodded, but before we could move, a sound froze us in place. It was a creak, low and distant, coming from the direction of the morgue. We exchanged panicked looks. Could the man have found another way in? The sound came again, louder this time, followed by a dull thud. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure Lucas could hear it. "Should we check it out?" Lucas asked, his voice barely a whisper. I wanted to say no, to run in the opposite direction, and never look back, but I knew we couldn't ignore it. With hesitant steps, we began to move toward the morgue. Each step felt like it was dragging us deeper into a nightmare we couldn't wake from. The shadows seemed to shift around us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When we reached the morgue door, we stopped. There were no more sounds coming from inside, just an oppressive silence that weighed down on us like a suffocating blanket. Lucas reached out a trembling hand toward the handle, but before he could touch it, we heard footsteps approaching quickly behind us. We spun around, panic making my heart leap into my throat, only to see a security guard running toward us. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, breathless. We got a motion alert from the morgue area. Lucas and I exchanged glances, a mix of relief and renewed fear washing over us. Whatever was happening, we were no longer alone in facing it. A strange man was here, I began to explain to the guard, my voice still shaky. He wanted to get into the morgue. He offered us money to let him in. The guard frowned, his expression growing grave. "Describe him," he said, pulling a radio from his belt. As Lucas detailed the man's appearance, I watched the guard's face visibly pale. He exchanged a few quick words over the radio before turning back to us. "You did the right thing by refusing and calling us," he said, his voice tense. "This man has tried to get into the morgue before. We suspect he's involved in illegal activities." A chill ran down my spine at his words. My mind began racing, imagining what exactly illegal activities could mean when it came to a morgue. Organ trafficking? Necrophilia? The possibilities were so horrifying that I felt sick just thinking about them. "Well, what do you think he wanted?" I asked hesitantly, not sure I really wanted to know the answer. The guard shook his head, his face grim. "We're not sure, but nothing good, that's for sure. We're going to increase security immediately." In the following minutes, the hospital became a controlled frenzy of activity. More guards arrived, searching every corner of the building. The police were called, and soon we could hear the sirens approaching outside. Lucas and I were questioned separately, having to repeat our story several times. With each retelling, the reality of what had happened sank in deeper, becoming more terrifying. This wasn't just a strange incident anymore. It was part of something bigger, something sinister that I couldn't fully grasp. When I was finally released to return to my post, the sun was already rising, casting a pale, ghostly light through the hospital corridors. The day shift was arriving, bringing with it the usual buzz of activity. But for me, the hospital would never be the same again. Every shadow now seemed to hide a threat, every dark corner a possible hiding place for that disturbing man. I sat at my desk, physically and emotionally exhausted, but unable to relax. My eyes kept drifting toward the corridor that led to the morgue. Even in the daylight, with increased security, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had almost happened there. And worse, I couldn't shake the fear that somehow it wasn't over. That man was still out there, somewhere, and something told me he wouldn't give up easily. That night had changed everything, and I knew the shadows of the hospital now held secrets far darker than I could have ever imagined. In the weeks following the incident, the hospital turned into a fortress. Additional security cameras were installed, especially around the morgue. Armed guards patrolled the corridors 24/7. For most of the staff and patients, these measures were reassuring. For me, they were a constant reminder of the danger that had infiltrated our midst. Every time I saw a guard, my heart would race, part of me expecting to see that pale face and those empty eyes again. My night shift, once a monotonous routine, had now become an exercise in paranoia. Every shadow seemed to move, every unexpected noise made me jump. The corridor leading to the morgue, in particular, felt darker and more oppressive than ever. Even with extra lights installed, there was something in the darkness that felt alive, pulsing with an invisible threat. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that strange man standing there, smiling his empty smile. Lucas, my colleague, seemed to be coping with the situation a bit better than I was. He tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, joking about us being the heroes who stopped the body snatcher. But I could see the tension in his eyes, the way he too remained alert to every unexpected sound. One night, as we were making our rounds, he confessed, "You know, Ethan, sometimes I think about what would have happened if we'd taken the money. And then I feel sick just thinking about it." I nodded silently, understanding exactly what he meant. The days dragged on, each shift feeling longer than the last. The feeling of being watched never fully left me. Sometimes, late at night, when the hospital was at its quietest, I swore I could hear footsteps echoing down the empty halls. Other times, I would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing but shadows. Rationality told me it was just my overactive imagination, fueled by stress and lack of sleep. But a deeper, more primal part of me screamed that the danger was still there, waiting, watching. One night, about a month after the incident, I was doing my usual rounds when I noticed something strange. One of the security cameras near the morgue seemed to have been moved, pointing at a slightly different angle than usual. My heart began to race as I approached to investigate. That's when I heard it, a soft sound, almost imperceptible, coming from inside the morgue. I froze in place, my whole body tense like a tightly wound violin string. Could it be? Had he returned? My trembling hand reached for the radio on my belt, ready to call for help, when suddenly, the door to the morgue slowly creaked open with a sharp squeal. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest as I stood there, paralyzed, staring into the darkness beyond the door. For an endless moment, nothing happened. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was just Dr. Patel, the night shift pathologist, looking as surprised to see me as I was to see him. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" he asked, frowning. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. I saw the camera was out of position and heard a noise. I stammered, suddenly feeling foolish and paranoid. Dr. Patel smiled understandingly. Yes, I bumped into the camera earlier. Should have informed security. As for the noise, well, sometimes the dead have their secrets, don't they? He chuckled at his own joke, but the sound only served to deepen my unease. I forced a smile in response and quickly excused myself, eager to get away from the morgue and its secrets. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Dr. Patel's explanation. Why had he been working with the lights off? And why hadn't I seen him enter earlier? I returned to my station, but I couldn't calm down. My mind kept going back to that moment of terror when the door opened, imagining what could have been if it hadn't been Dr. Patel on the other side. What if it had been the strange man? What would I have done? What would he have done to me? These questions swirled in my head, feeding a fear that seemed to grow with every passing minute. I tried to focus on my work, but every little noise, every shadow made me jump. The hospital, once just my place of work, now felt like a maze of hidden dangers and unseen threats. As the night wore on, my paranoia only deepened. I began to question everything and everyone. Did I really know Dr. Patel that well? What if he was somehow involved with the strange man? And what about the other night shift workers? Could I trust them? Every familiar face suddenly seemed to hide dark secrets. I found myself scrutinizing my colleagues, looking for signs of suspicious behavior. Lucas, in particular, seemed nervous and distracted. Did he know something he wasn't telling me? By the time my shift finally ended, I felt as though I'd aged years in a single night. I left the hospital for the fresh morning air, but not even the rising sun could dispel the sense of dread that had settled in my chest. As I drove home, I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a car following me. At home, I checked and rechecked the locks, closed all the curtains. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Lying in bed, unable to sleep despite my exhaustion, I came to a terrifying realization. The encounter with the strange man hadn't just changed my experience at the hospital. It had changed my perception of the entire world. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but the memory of that fateful night refused to fade. Though the strange man had not been seen again, his presence seemed to linger in every corner of the hospital, in every shadowed hallway. I continued to do my job, but it was as if I were going through the motions, my body present while my mind was constantly on high alert. Every patient who passed by, every late-night visitor, every new face, they all became potential threats in my hypervigilant mind. The worst were the nights. The oppressive silence that had once been merely an inconvenience now felt loaded with imminent danger. The empty corridors echoed with phantom footsteps, and every dark corner seemed to hide sinister secrets. The morgue, in particular, had become a source of terror for me. I avoided passing by whenever possible, and when I was forced to, my heart would race and my breathing would become shallow. Sometimes, I swore I could hear voices whispering behind that closed door, though reason told me it was impossible. My life outside the hospital had been affected as well. I started seeing threats everywhere. In the man standing on the corner, in the car parked in front of my house, in the neighbor who greeted me every morning. My dreams were haunted by visions of the strange man, his pale face and empty eyes chasing me through endless hallways. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of his footsteps still ringing in my ears. I tried to seek help, to talk to friends and family about what had happened, but how could I explain the terror I felt without sounding completely insane? Work, once just a means of making a living, had become a daily ordeal. Every shift was a battle against my own fears and paranoia. I began noticing worried glances from my colleagues, whispers when I passed by. I knew my behavior was changing, that I was becoming more withdrawn, more jumpy, but I couldn't help it. The constant feeling of being watched, of something terrible about to happen, was overwhelming. Sometimes I would catch myself staring at the morgue door, half expecting, half dreading it to open and for the strange man to emerge, his empty smile beckoning me into the dark secrets he kept. Even months later, as I drove home after my shifts, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that sinister figure following me. The shadows seemed darker, the nighttime silence heavier. I knew I would never forget that disturbing encounter, and the thought that something monstrous could have happened that night continued to haunt me. The strange man had disappeared, but the fear he planted in me remained, a dark seed that had taken deep root in my psyche. I realized that even if I never saw him again, the terror of that night in the morgue would follow me forever, a constant reminder of the horrors that can lurk in the shadows of the seemingly normal world around us. The silence of the early morning was broken by the dull hum of the fluorescent lights in the convenience store. Ben, stood behind the counter, my eyes scanning the neatly arranged shelves and the immaculately clean floor. It was another typical night shift at this small store on the outskirts of Carson City, Nevada. The clock on the wall showed 3:45 a.m., and I could already feel the exhaustion creeping into my bones. But the end of my shift was near. Soon, the sun would rise, bringing with it the conclusion of yet another uneventful night in this sleepy town. I walked slowly through the aisles, checking to make sure everything was in order. My footsteps echoed in the emptiness of the store, reminding me of the solitude that accompanied this job. Sometimes I wonder why I stuck with it. Maybe it was the decent pay, or perhaps it was the comfort of routine. Either way, here I was, night after night, the lone guardian of this small kingdom of canned goods and soft drinks. I ran my hand along the shelf of chips, straightening a bag that was slightly out of place. It was an automatic gesture, born from hours of boredom and the need to keep my hands busy. I returned to the counter and began counting the cash in the register. It was a task I usually left for the end of my shift, but tonight, time seemed to be dragging more than usual. The bills slipped through my fingers as I counted methodically. $20, $40, $60. The soft sound of paper mixed with the hum of the lights and the distant whir of the drink cooler. It was a familiar symphony, almost comforting in its predictability. I glanced outside through the large glass windows. The parking lot was empty, lit only by the yellow glow of the streetlights. Beyond it, the night stretched out like a blanket over the sleeping town. It was a view I knew well, a landscape as familiar to me as the inside of the store. We rarely had customers at this hour. The few who did show up were usually passing drivers, stopping for a quick coffee or to fill up their gas tanks. I envied them sometimes, imagining where they might be headed, what adventures awaited them on the road ahead. I sighed and looked at the clock again. Still an hour to go before the end of my shift. I turned my attention back to counting the money, letting my thoughts drift. I was so absorbed in the task and my daydreams that I barely noticed the sound of the doors opening. It was only when I heard the loud crash that my head shot up, my eyes widening at the sight before me. In an instant, the peace of the night was shattered, and I found myself face to face with a nightmare I could never have predicted. The doors to the store had flown open with a deafening bang, sending my heart into my throat. For a moment, I was frozen, my eyes locked on the figure that had just barged into my quiet little sanctuary. It was a man, but not like any other who had entered the store before. His appearance was shocking. Torn and filthy clothes clung to his thin frame, and his wild, bloodshot eyes darted around the room with disturbing intensity. He moved erratically, as if each step was a battle against some invisible force. Time seemed to slow as the man staggered toward me. I could hear my own breath, quick and shallow, echoing in my ears. The acrid smell of sweat and grime filled my nostrils as he drew closer. His eyes met mine, and in them, I saw a desperation so profound that it sent a shiver down my spine. There was nothing human in that gaze. It was the look of a cornered animal, dangerous in its unpredictability. Before I could react, he was on me. His hands, surprisingly fast for someone in his state, dove into the stack of bills I still held. The touch of his grimy fingers against mine made me recoil instinctively. In the blink of an eye, the money I had so meticulously counted vanished, snatched up by the trembling hands of the intruder. There were no words, no threats, just that desperate look and the quick, decisive motion. I stood there, motionless, as the robber backed away with the same speed with which he had arrived. My mind was blank, unable to process what had just happened. The hum of the fluorescent lights, once a comforting background noise, now seemed deafening against the sudden silence that followed his exit. I looked down at my empty hands, still outstretched where the money had been moments before. Then something snapped inside me. A wave of adrenaline surged through my body, dissolving the initial shock. Without thinking about the consequences, without considering the danger, I moved. My feet carried me from behind the counter, heading for the door. A voice in the back of my mind screamed that this was insane, that I should stay put and call the police. But that voice was drowned out by the roar of blood in my ears and the sudden, irrational determination not to let that man get away. With my heart pounding in my chest, I stepped out into the night, my eyes locked on the staggering figure retreating across the parking lot. My feet slapped against the asphalt, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. The cold air burned my lungs as I ran, eyes fixed on the erratic silhouette of the thief ahead of me. He wasn't far, his movements clumsy and uneven, as though each step was a struggle. A part of my mind kept screaming that this was madness, that I should turn back to the safety of the store and call the police. But something stronger pushed me forward, a mix of adrenaline and indignation that drowned out any rational thought. The thief glanced back, his eyes wide with panic as he realized he was being chased. He tried to quicken his pace, but his body seemed unwilling to comply. He stumbled once, nearly falling, but managed to right himself and keep moving. I could hear his labored breathing, punctuated by occasional gasps of desperation. The distance between us was closing with every second, and I felt a surge of confidence. I can catch him, I thought, pushing myself to run even faster. The streetlights cast strange shadows as we ran, turning the scene into something surreal. We passed parked cars, their metallic surfaces reflecting our chase like a silent film. The quiet of the night was broken only by the sound of our footsteps and heavy breaths. There was no one on the streets to witness this bizarre spectacle. A convenience store clerk chasing down a desperate thief through the deserted streets of Carson City. We turned a corner, entering a darker street. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I was close now, almost within reach. I could see the details of his tattered clothing, the sweat glistening on the back of his neck. The smell of sweat and desperation filled the air between us. I reached out, my fingers nearly brushing his back. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice sounding strange and distant in my own ears. At that moment, I realized just how dangerous my situation was. I was alone, chasing a desperate and potentially dangerous man, with no idea what I would do if I actually caught him. What if he was armed? What if he turned and attacked me? Fear began to mix with the adrenaline, but it was too late to turn back. We were locked in this frantic dance, running through the dark streets, heading toward an inevitable confrontation. The convenience store, with its safety and familiarity, felt like it was a world away now. Suddenly, the thief made a sharp turn, heading back toward the parking lot of the store. Maybe he was disoriented, or maybe it was a desperate attempt to shake me off. Whatever the reason, that unexpected move gave me the advantage I needed. With one final burst of energy, I lunged forward, my hands closing around his arms. The impact sent us both crashing to the ground, tumbling over the rough asphalt in a mess of limbs and muffled grunts. For a moment, we lay there, panting and dazed. Then, the reality of the situation hit me like a freight train. I was lying on the ground in a dark parking lot, grappling with a desperate, potentially dangerous man. Panic threatened to overtake me, but I forced myself to stay in control. "It's over," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Hand over the money and stay down until the police get here." The man squirmed beneath my grip, his wild eyes meeting mine. Up close, I could see the fear and desperation etched into every line of his face. His skin was pale and sweaty, and his entire body trembled with a constant shudder. "Please," he croaked, his voice ragged and broken. "You don't understand. I need this. I have no choice." His words took me by surprise, causing me to hesitate for a crucial moment. Sensing my distraction, the thief mustered what little strength he had left and shoved me away with a sudden burst of energy. I fell backward, my head smacking painfully against the asphalt. By the time I managed to sit up, dazed, I saw the man already on his feet, staggering toward the shadows. He moved with difficulty, every step seeming to cause him pain. Part of me wanted to get up and continue the chase, but my aching body refused to cooperate. I sat there, helpless, watching as the thief disappeared into the darkness. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, leaving me trembling and exhausted. My head throbbed where I had hit the ground, and I could feel scratches stinging on my arms and legs. The night silence returned to the parking lot, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. The sense of safety I had always felt in this familiar place had been irreparably shattered. And as I slowly stood up, a new resolution formed in my mind. This wasn't over yet. With shaky legs, I pulled myself up from the cold asphalt. My head still ached from the impact, and I could taste the metallic tang of blood in my mouth. I looked into the darkness where the thief had vanished, a mix of frustration and relief washing over me. On one hand, I had failed to stop him. On the other, I was thankful to have come out of this dangerous situation relatively unharmed. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my frayed nerves, and pulled my phone from my pocket with trembling hands. I dialed 911, my fingers leaving smudges of sweat on the phone screen. As I waited for the call to connect, my eyes kept scanning the shadows, half expecting the thief to reappear. The calm voice of the dispatcher on the other end brought me back to reality. 911, what's your emergency? I swallowed hard, my voice coming out hoarse and shaky as I began to explain what had happened. As I described the robbery and the ensuing chase, the adrenaline continued to drain from my system, leaving me with a profound sense of exhaustion. The dispatcher assured me that a patrol car was on the way and instructed me to return to the store and wait for the police. I hesitated for a moment, reluctant to lose sight of the thief completely. He can't have gone far, I muttered, more to myself than to the dispatcher. He looked exhausted, desperate even. Slowly, I began walking back toward the store, my eyes still scanning the dark streets. That's when I saw him again. There he was, alone, staggering figure under the dim light of a distant street lamp. He was moving slowly now, as if every step was an enormous effort. My heart began to race again, but this time not from fear. There was something deeply unsettling about the sight of that man, so clearly broken and desperate. I can still see him, I informed the dispatcher, my voice low as if afraid the thief might hear me, even from that distance. He's on Oak Street, heading north. He looks like he can barely walk. The dispatcher thanked me for the information and reminded me once more to return to the safety of the store. Reluctantly, I obeyed, my eyes never leaving the distant figure of the thief. As I made my way back, the sound of approaching sirens began to echo through the quiet night, breaking the eerie silence. The wail of the sirens grew louder, reverberating through the empty streets of Carson City. Standing at the entrance of the store, I watched as the flashing blue and red lights approached quickly. My gaze shifted between the police cars and the distant figure of the thief, who had now stopped walking. He was standing under a street lamp, as if he had finally realized there was nowhere left to run. The patrol cars screeched to a halt, flooding the parking lot with their flashing lights. Four officers stepped out quickly, their hands instinctively moving to their weapons. "Where is he?" one of them shouted at me. I silently pointed toward the lone figure in the street. The officers exchanged quick glances before two of them began to cautiously approach the suspect, while the others stayed behind, keeping their weapons trained on him. I watched the scene unfold as if I were watching a movie. The thief made no move to flee or resist. When the officers reached him, he simply raised his hands in silent surrender. There was something profoundly sad about the scene. The man who minutes earlier had been a terrifying threat now seemed small and defeated under the flashing lights of the patrol cars. The officers handcuffed him without incident and led him back to the parking lot. As they passed me, I got a clear look at the thief's face for the first time since the robbery. His eyes were downcast, avoiding eye contact, but I could see the silent tears streaming down his dirt-streaked cheeks. There was no trace of the wild desperation I had seen earlier, only exhaustion and absolute defeat. One of the officers approached me, notepad in hand. "Sir, we'll need your statement," he said, his voice professional and neutral. I nodded mechanically, my eyes still fixed on the thief being led to the squad car. As I began recounting the events of the night, a strange, unsettling feeling began to form in the back of my mind. Something about this entire situation didn't feel right, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. The adrenaline of the night was wearing off, leaving behind a confusing mix of emotions I didn't know how to process. As I finished giving my statement, one of the officers came over with more information about the thief. "We know this guy," he said, his voice carrying a mix of professionalism and pity. "He's a local homeless man, probably high on something. This isn't the first time he's gotten himself into trouble." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. Suddenly, the image of the desperate man took on a new context, a story I hadn't considered in my initial panic. I watched as the officers rummaged through the man's pockets, retrieving the stolen money. It was such a small amount, I realize now, so insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but apparently important enough to drive someone to desperation. The man remained silent, his eyes fixed on the ground, looking even smaller and more fragile than before. I felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over me. Relief that the money had been recovered, but also a growing sense of discomfort. One of the officers handed me back the crumpled bills, thanking me for my cooperation. I held the wrinkled money in my hands, feeling its weight in a way I had never felt before. Each bill seemed to carry a story of desperation and need that I had never really considered. I looked again at the man being placed into the squad car, trying to reconcile the image of the terrifying robber with his pathetic, broken figure. As the adrenaline continued to subside, I began to question my own actions. I had been so impulsive, so determined to play the hero. But now, faced with the reality of the situation, I didn't feel heroic at all. Just tired, confused, and strangely guilty. What could drive someone to such an act of desperation? What circumstances in life could push a person to this point? These questions swirled in my mind, with no easy answers. The patrol cars began to pull away, taking the man to a destination I could hardly imagine. I stood there, holding the recovered money in my hands, and the even heavier weight of reflection in my mind. The night, which had started so normal and routine, had turned into something I knew would haunt me for a long time. As I watched the lights of the squad cars disappear into the distance, I realized that something fundamental had shifted inside me. The simplicity of my worldview had been irrevocably shaken. Back inside the store, the familiar hum of the fluorescent lights and the silence of the aisles now felt strangely alien. I walked slowly through the aisles, mechanically placing the money back into the register. Every action felt surreal, as if I were moving through a dream. The clock on the wall read 5:30 a.m. My shift was almost over, but I felt as though I had lived a lifetime in that one night. I sat behind the counter, my eyes wandering across the familiar space of the store. Everything was exactly as it had been before. The shelves neatly organized, the floor spotless, the magazines perfectly aligned. But I knew nothing would be the same again. The sense of security I had always felt in this place had been irrevocably shattered. Every shadow now seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sudden noise made my heart jump. I found myself thinking about the man, the thief, the homeless man, the desperate one. Where was he now? What happened to him? And, more disturbingly, how many others like him were out there, hidden in the shadows, ready to break into someone's life in a moment of desperation? The reality of the world beyond the safe walls of the store suddenly felt much closer and far more frightening than I had ever imagined. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the store windows, I felt a deep weariness settle into my bones. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion from the night's events, but an emotional fatigue, a weight I knew I would carry with me for a long time. The idea that something so violent and unsettling could happen in a place so ordinary, so routine, shook me to my core. When my replacement arrived for the morning shift, he found me still sitting behind the counter, lost in thought. I handed the shift over to him mechanically, unable to find the words to explain what had happened. As I stepped out of the store, into the parking lot now bathed in daylight, I felt as though I was emerging from a completely different world. The sun was shining. People were starting their daily routines, unaware of the drama that had unfolded here just hours earlier. As I walked home, I knew I carried with me not only the physical marks of the night, but also a new understanding of the world, a view that was both darker and more compassionate. The night of the robbery had ended, but its echoes, I knew, would linger in my life for a long time to come.